One fine day, the Viscount and his daughter came to an important celebration. The Viscount, looking at his daughter, declared that she must behave impeccably because this reception was very important for her. The Viscount said that her fiancé would also be present, and therefore she should behave appropriately. A moment later, he pointed her in the direction of the Leighton family's home. The Viscount reported that right in front of them was the Duke of Leighton and his wife. Irina looked at them with bewilderment as she saw the former duchess. She was a noble daughter of an impoverished family, sold into a ducal house, a widow whose husband, a former duke, died soon after marriage, and she was a stepmother who was younger than the duke. At that very moment, the Viscount came closer to them and greeted the duke. He looked closely at his daughter, as she was expected to greet them in the same way. Irina bowed deeply, but she was very worried. But at that very moment, she felt unwell. The Viscount was shocked. But the lady did not know what to do, since she had been starving for several days in order to stand out at the reception. The Viscount was shocked and shouted at his daughter to bow properly immediately. Wilhelmina flew up to the lady and quickly wrapped her in a cape, but she was puzzled because she saw that the lady was very thin. Everyone present froze in shock, as they did not expect to see anything like this. Wilhelmina was shocked because she saw that the lady was lightly dressed, while she was wearing high heels and a tight corset. Wilhelmina looked closely at the girl and asked if she was eating anything. Irina could not utter a word, but she looked at the Duchess with warmth because it reminded her of her grandmother, who also looked after her with warmth and care. Wilhelmina married into a noble family drowning in debt, and the only thing she could do was to find a job as quickly as possible and try her best to earn money. But after a while, she wondered why the debilitating feeling seemed so familiar. It was at that moment that she remembered her past life. After all, in her past life, she was a teacher at a training center and died at the age of 32, later moving to a fantasy world. At that moment, she thought that she had been reborn, which meant that she could use the knowledge from her past life, and this life would become much easier. But unfortunately, at that moment, her family suddenly went bankrupt. As expected, it was also sold as if it were confiscated goods. Wilhelmina, I understood that in this fantasy world, the concept of human rights was barely discernible, and she could not even refuse the inheritance. But after some time, she saw a man. He stared at her for a while and said that he was taking her. She was sold as a wife to an elderly aristocrat who had already buried 4 wives. After some time, she learned her new surname, and at the same time, she heard that this family was influential in the West. She understood that he had many wives, and they all seemed to suffer greatly when they were married to him. Wilhelmina wondered if she should run away, but after a moment, she dismissed those thoughts more easily, as she realized that she had nowhere to run. When she arrived, she was informed at the gate that the Duke had died. She was informed that he had died of a heart attack, but since she had not had time to hold the wedding ceremony with the Duke, she should still attend the funeral. Wilhelmina was shocked, because for the first time in both of her lives, she had married, and at the same time, she had become a widow in record time. In the confused ducal house, no one cared about the new mistress. She was never introduced to the family or the estate, but was simply sent to a separate estate. A few months later, the maid said with a smile, "Madam, that it would be nice if she dined with the Duke and Duchess in the main castle." Wilhelmina said with a smile that this was enough for her, because she liked living with them. Anna looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes as she was touched by her words. The lady asked the maid if she really had business in the main house today. She stated that this was not the case, but there was an investiture ceremony last week, so the Duke is probably still busy. The maid said that a New Year's reception would soon be held, and that high-ranking guests from the imperial family would be there. But the lady was not at all interested in this. She understood that as soon as everything was settled, she would be thrown out into the street, because no family would want to keep a young widow. At the same time, she hoped that if she was kicked out or sent on a trip, they would at least give her a little money for the journey. A moment later, a man came to them and apologized for the intrusion, but he informed the young lady that the mistress wished to see her. Wilhelmina, in turn, understood that the Duchess wanted to see her, but she did not understand why. At that very moment, the young man declared that this concerned her future, and she was upset as she realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Wilhelmina timidly asked if they really wanted to see her now, and the young man stated that it was all true. A moment later, the young man told Wilhelmina that the lady had asked her to watch her speech. Wilhelmina wondered if the Duchess wanted her to know her place and speak to her respectfully. The man stated that although the circumstances were difficult, she was still the senior in rank, and the Duchess was very strict about hierarchy, so she should address her as her daughter-in-law. Wilhelmina was younger than her husband, and besides, they were strangers, so it was not easy to address her as her elder. The perfect lady in the proud and flawless pearl of the West, Helena von Leighton. Wilhelmina, in turn, looking at the Duchess, wondered whether discipline was really more important to her than pride. The Duchess looked at the lady intently and greeted her, calling her mother. The young lady looked intently at the Duchess as she bowed in a curtsy. In turn, she wondered if she was not at all awkward. At that very moment, she smiled and declared that they had met for the first time. Helena apologized for visiting so late. A moment later, Helena invited her mother to move. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, as she felt awkward playing the role of mother-in-law. But still, before her was Helena, a representative of imperial blood and the mistress of the house. The maid served them tea, but the Duchess told the maid to serve her mother first. The first one, who was called the Ideal Lady. The woman known as a star of high society, a role model for all noble maidens, is none other than Helena. Helena sighed heavily and stated that she really hoped that her mother had chewed well all day. Wilhelmina said that it was, but she also asked the Duchess how she had chewed all this time. Helena, in the same manner, stated that she, as always, spent her days in worries. Wilhelmina understood the woman's words, and they sounded as if she shouldn't be offended, since she was too busy to invite her over. After a moment, Helena sighed heavily and stated that first of all, she would like to discuss their plans for the future. The young lady knew that the time had come, and at that very moment, she began to speak. But Helena interrupted her and stated that they would like to accept her as a full member of the family. Wilhelmina, in turn, was very shocked by such a statement. At that very moment, she felt ashamed of her actions because she screamed out of surprise. She did not understand what was happening because she was sure that they would simply throw her out. Helena stated that after she became a real part of their home, they wanted her to take part in the New Year and New Year's Eve receptions. Although she had never appeared in high society, even she understood how important the New Year's reception at the ducal house was, and if she really showed up at such a place, no matter how high the family's titles, they would not be able to avoid gossip. She remembered that she had said that there would be high-ranking guests at the reception. Since even the ducal house mentioned him with such respect, it meant that this man really occupied a high status. Frankly, she wanted to ask if they were in their right minds, as unpleasant as it was to admit, but she was most likely a stain on the reputation of the ducal house. Wilhelmina understood that this was hardly out of pity, because it was not charity. She knew that the title of mother-in-law itself gave her considerable power, and allowing her to keep it out of simple emotions would be too risky for the family. At that moment, she wondered, what if all this was happening against Helena's will? She remembered how the butler said that the Duchess strictly adhered to the hierarchy. Wilhelmina wondered if she really was higher up in the hierarchy. The Leighton family was one of only 2 ducal houses in the empire, yet she knew there was only one person who could put pressure on them. In a moment, she wondered if this was really just the emperor's whim. Helena flinched, not expecting anything like that. The young lady realized that she had guessed correctly, and at the same time, she understood what she should pay attention to. She was surprised that the emperor made it clear that he was watching her, since he was a new man and had only ascended to the throne last year. Moreover, they said that he supported the Eastern nobility, since they played a key role in his ascension to the throne. Here is Leighton of the Western gentry. Your empress, the wife of the former emperor, gave birth to the eldest prince and Helena, and then the current emperor, the son of the second empress, passed away. In their eyes, the emperor, who had overthrown the eldest prince and taken his place, was undoubtedly a political opponent, and Helena, the prince's own sister, undoubtedly looked like a political opponent. Wilhelmina knew that Leighton was a powerful house with extensive holdings and impressive wealth, and had enormous influence in high society. The emperor, who had just ascended to the throne, could not so easily touch them. Denigrating such a family or turning political intrigue against them was not an easy task. At that very moment, the young lady realized that it was the death of the former duke that had created the breach. She could judge from the Duchess's reaction that the emperor had taken advantage of this. But now, the picture was becoming clearer to her. After all, the cruel previous duke, who had killed 4 wives, suddenly died. And the House of Leighton, who had bought the 5th wife, now wanted to get rid of her as an unnecessary commodity. This is blatant immorality for the emperor, who controlled the noble registers. This is more than enough to intervene. No one except the emperor would have dared to force the ducal house to accept a great lady from an impoverished family. In the end, they decided it was better to keep it under his own roof, rather than expel and attract the emperor's wrath. Even if the emperor did not directly pressure them, it is possible that they were simply scared and decided to play it safe. Be that as it may, it proved how sensitive the ducal house was to the political situation in the empire. Now they could not kick her out. At the same moment, she said with a smile that it was very interesting. The Duchess was stunned by her reaction. A moment later, the young lady realized what political intrigue really was. She said with a smile that life in a separate estate was comfortable, and it seemed to her that everything would continue to be calm. And since Helena asked her, she decided to attend the reception. At that very moment, she stated that, unfortunately, she lacked many skills, so she needed help. She had neither a dress nor any jewelry. Even for a person far removed from social events, it was clear that if she had appeared in a nightgown, everyone would have laughed at her. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she needed to buy something. Helena sighed heavily and asked if she needed anything else. Wilhelmina said she heard it gets very cold in the West in winter, so she could use some outerwear. Helena said that she would certainly send a tailor to her. She immediately called her maid, as she wanted to give her a task. Wilhelmina immediately declared that she did not need a tailor, but he was needed by the boys who worked on their separate estate. At that moment, she thought about it and, after counting, declared that she needed about 30 sets. Wilhelmina sighed and stated that she thought the servants' clothes were too light, and everyone present froze in shock. It was not hard to guess who made the maids wear such tight tops. She knew that her maid came every morning and warmed herself by the fireplace. Wilhelmina, looking at the Duchess, declared that this would be enough. The Duchess looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was sure of her words. The young lady said with a smile that everything was correct. Wilhelmina looked at Helen intently, but seeing her stunned expression, she expected that, having sorted out the situation, she would ask for money or jewelry. But the young lady knew that greed could play a cruel joke. Even though the situation had now changed in her favor, she was still a nobody in the ducal house, and she had no connections. She knew that if she went too far, she might be left as only a nominal senior mistress, without any real power. Therefore, when the house showed generosity, it had to be accepted calmly. And this became her new life principle. A moment later, she announced with a smile that it was time for her to leave, as she had a morning meeting. Wilhelmina knew that at this time, the little ones from the laundry were coming to her, and she wondered if, in a world with magic, they hadn't invented a washing machine with their hot water. But a moment later, the young lady stopped. Helena looked at her in surprise, not understanding what else she wanted to say. Wilhelmina looked at Helena and declared that she was a wonderful daughter-in-law. Helena was taken aback and asked in surprise what she meant. The lady declared that this was not just politeness, but sincere praise, and she was now speaking in all seriousness. Calling a person she couldn't stand mother was no easy task, but now she understood even more what a strong and resilient character was hidden behind the mask of the ideal housewife. For a moment, Helena sat in a daze, staring intently after the young lady. After some time, she stood by the window and thought about Wilhelmina's words. She also remembered the servants who spoke warmly of her, because they said that she was very kind and took great care of them. And she also remembered all their names. Sometimes they noticed that she spoke sharply to them, but in reality, she was very worried about them, and Helena wondered whether she was a kind woman or whether it was a mask. Helena realized that, even if she didn't try to hide it on purpose, in just a short conversation, she was able to figure out the situation in their home and the general politics. Although her background was modest, she certainly had the ability to analyze situations. And she had previously said that she studied political science at the academy. She understood that a person who understood politics could not simply be kind. She wanted to send a butler. He came from the imperial palace and was well informed about the political situation. But, on the other hand, He is too soft and fair, so in such moments, you can't really rely on him. She knew she had a meeting with her children soon, but she also knew she would have to cut the meeting short. Helena looked at the children playing outside in bewilderment, but she knew she needed to tell the nurse to keep a better eye on their schedule. At the same time, the brother and sister were happily playing outside, and at the same time, they wanted to see their mother as soon as possible. They hoped that she would like the flowers that they would pick for her. She closed the curtains for a moment and walked to the exit. All the while, Wilhelmina was on her mind. Specifically, what she remembered most was the moment when the girl declared that she considered her a wonderful daughter-in-law. Helena didn't understand why she had suddenly come to such a conclusion when she had only seen him once. Helena, in turn, saw her gaze, which read right through her. Although she was younger than her, for this reason, she did not like the girl. The young lady looked intently at her teacher and said that she must fill in the most important thing about the return of transmigration and reincarnation. She said that this is the basis of web novels. The return preserved the memory and knowledge that the hero had. Having one of the students rant about cliches for a few minutes helped her when she transformed into Wilhelmina. But now she understood that this was not enough. She preferred to be reborn as the leader of world history. Even in a fantasy world, she would have at least a little better understanding of human rights, working conditions, and culture. Wilhelmina was a little puzzled as she saw that child labor was now being exploited, and the working hours were very brutal. She lived in a separate building, so she changed her schedule at her own discretion. Some time ago, she informed the maid that she did not need help washing, and it was enough for them to prepare food. She yelled at the maid because she was cleaning at night, and even at midnight, she said that the maid could do it at any time. She didn't understand how such little children, the eldest of whom was only 10 years old, could work to earn money. She knew that if they were born into aristocratic families, they would become knights. Wilhelmina understood that things would be a little easier for them then, but they were forced to do hard work. She couldn't say that they shouldn't do this kind of work. She knew that taking their work away would mean taking away their place in society. Wilhelmina, I understood that this problem was not only the management that forced children to work, but also the social system itself that allowed it. A moment later, all her thoughts disappeared as a young girl approached her. The girl said that her facial expression looked very stern. She was taken aback as she realized that her expression frightened them. But at that very moment, she declared that everything was fine. They didn't need to worry. She also asked the girl if she had eaten the potatoes. She said with a smile that she had eaten everything and didn't need more. Wilhelmina realized that the girl was simply remembering how she used to sit her on her lap. Wilhelmina asked the girl with a smile if she wanted to sit on her lap. The young lady asked with a smile if such a thing was possible, and Wilhelmina said that of course it was. The lady asked the eldest lady with a smile if she would really live in the estate, and Wilhelmina said with a smile that it seemed so. At that very moment, the young lady felt relieved. Wilhelmina realized that the children had also decided that she would soon be leaving the outbuilding, which was not surprising since there had been a lot of talk behind her back. Wilhelmina understood that she should still thank the emperor. Wilhelmina looked at the girl with a smile and asked what she would do today. She said that she would go into the garden and pull out the weeds. They had grown very tough in the fall, so it took a lot of effort. She said they had a friend who was good at it, and he was great at pulling weeds, and his name was Johann. The lady sheepishly stated that the boy was running errands and doing daytime work. He had been hired as a gardener in the spring and had had plenty of work in the summer, but now in the fall, there was almost none, and he found himself in a difficult situation. She stated that they offered him to work with them, but he didn't like it. Wilhelmina asked in surprise why he didn't like it. The girl stated that he was afraid of aristocrats, and he thought that if he suddenly made a mistake, they would immediately start hitting him on the shoulders. She said that she told him that their eldest lady was not that kind of person, but he was adamant, and he had no parents, and she was very worried about him. Wilhelmina knew what the late Duke was like, and so she understood the boy. She asked the girl if he really lived alone. She said that he lived with his younger sister. She was still very small, so he was the only one earning money, but she heard that they had nothing to eat now, and they ate porridge made from tree chicken. Wilhelmina looked closely at all the children present and asked if they were getting along well with Johann. They said that he was very strong and smart, and he helped them a lot, even if it was not his job. Wilhelmina was surprised by their words, as she understood that the boy was an authority among the children. Wilhelmina wondered if he really did a good job with all the work. After all the praise, she realized that she had to meet him, because she just needed someone to run errands for her outside business. Meanwhile, the boy worked tirelessly. After a moment, he took a short break. But looking at the beautiful building, he understood that one could not trust aristocrats. Once he made a mistake and they started beating him because of it, he begged for forgiveness. But it was all in vain. The man was furious. He couldn't understand how the boy had dared to stain his shoes with weeds. Just because he was a mistake and didn't pull out one weed, he was beaten like a beast. He understood that if he became a servant, life would be easier. But he also knew that if he was killed, his sister would be left alone. He knew that no matter how important money was, it was not more important than life. Johann knew he should be grateful he had a job at all. A moment later, he was taken aback as he saw the silhouette of a woman. He looked at the beautiful lady with bewilderment, as he did not know who she was. He saw that it was not the middle of winter, and she was wrapped not in a blanket, but in some kind of outerwear. Johann, in turn, looked at the lady with embarrassment, since he knew that he needed to continue working, and she was sitting right where there were a lot of weeds. He came closer to her and saw that there were no servants around, and she was wearing simple clothes, so it seemed to him that she was not from the nobility. Johann apologized and said he was going to pick some weeds. The lady turned around and apologized, asking if she had been in his way. The young man bowed, as he noticed that she was not an aristocrat. But the situation was still somehow strange. Wilhelmina looked closely at the boy and asked if he was Johann. Johann was taken aback and looked at the lady in surprise. Wilhelmina stated that she heard about him from Marina. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. She said with a smile that she had heard he was very good at pulling weeds. But the boy was taken aback and said that it was true. She smiled and said that she also heard that he was a smart and very kind older brother, which is why everyone was drawn to him. Johann looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what was happening at all, whether she was praising him or not. At that moment, he was taken aback, as she sat down next to him. Johann froze for a moment as he smelled a pleasant scent coming from the lady. He understood that this was not the intrusive perfume that aristocrats usually used, but a sweet aroma of oils and medicinal herbs. It seemed to him that he had smelled a similar smell somewhere before, and she asked with a smile if he liked potatoes. At that very moment, the lady presented him with some potatoes, and she said with a smile that these were, of course, not spring potatoes, but they were quite tasty. He was taken aback as he smelled the aroma of a wonderful dish. He realized that this was the same aroma as when his grandmother and mother were alive, the smell when they boiled herbs, when they baked bread. He felt a warm and pleasant feeling from the young lady, as well as a familiar smell. She smiled and said that she would help him peel the potatoes. After some time, she recalled their pleasant conversation. Although he was wary, they became a little closer. Wilhelmina knew that she had not managed to fully win his trust, even though she was a teacher at the academy. But she was still glad when he asked if he could come to see her again. Wilhelmina smiled and stated that he could do it, since she had been in a similar place every morning. She said she would bring him more baked potatoes, and these words warmed his soul. Wilhelmina recalled their conversation with a smile, as she saw that he was very smart. She knew almost nothing about what was going on outside the castle walls, so she wanted to hire him to gather information. She understood that since she had become the mistress, she should be aware of the affairs of the estate, and at the same time, she could give him a good side job. She looked forward to their next meeting, but a moment later, all her thoughts disappeared as she noticed a young man walking towards her. Wilhelmina looked at the butler from the main castle with bewilderment. She did not understand what he needed on her territory. A moment later, he came up to her and asked if she was okay. She was surprised and said that she was okay, but asked what happened. He stated that he had a message from the lady and that he had come to her on her behalf. Wilhelmina, looking at the young man, assumed that Helena was very busy. He said that it was so and asked her to understand and forgive her generously. She understood that Helena did not want to discuss trivial matters personally. She maintained the proprieties of a daughter-in-law, but had no intention of becoming closer. However, one could consider that she showed some courtesy. The young man announced that a small reception would be held in honor of the governor's services a week later. Helena was unable to attend due to a call to the capital. Wilhelmina asked if they really wanted her to go to the reception in the Duchess's place. The butler stated that she had recommended her in the hope that Wilhelmina would become accustomed to Western high society. Wilhelmina sighed and thanked them for so nicely calling her a replacement. The young man stated that several of the Duke's close associates, the governor, and close acquaintances would be at the reception. She sighed heavily and said that she agreed to go. The young lady understood that she had no choice anyway. She understood that this was a formal recommendation, but if she refused, there would be consequences. At least she was simply replacing the Duchess, and that would be enough, so she could consider herself lucky. The butler announced that he would invite a dressmaker and a socialite. He said that since she would be appearing in the Western world for the first time, she needed to know all the rules. Wilhelmina knew that she did not quite look like an aristocrat, and they wanted to teach her some manners. So she asked the butler to invite them in the afternoon. He asked her in surprise why she decided that. The young lady smiled and said that it was simple. Because she wanted to sleep in the morning, she had enough studying in the morning, so she wanted to get some sleep. He was a little surprised, but still agreed with her. After some time, the young lady met Madame. After some time, the lady saw Viscountess Roland. She was the best mentor who raised many young ladies. The lady looked intently at her new mentor, as she understood that her studies would soon begin. Viscountess Roland was the author of a book on modern etiquette for ladies, which became a hit in the capital. After her husband's death, she did not continue the family line, but voluntarily took up teaching etiquette, educating many ladies. Viscountess Roland taught her young student how to maintain proper posture with the utmost warmth and restraint. At some points, the Viscountess corrected the young lady. She also taught her table manners. At the same time, the Viscountess demonstrated how to pronounce a toast correctly. After some time, the young lady fell into bed with a thud. She understood that being the mistress of the Duke's house was not an easy task. She had expected this, but she was still dead tired. Wilhelmina was a little glad, as this day had brought her fewer reproaches. She knew that she would definitely do better tomorrow. The next day, the Viscountess said with surprise that the lady remained remarkably calm. Even with the slightest mistakes, Anna maintained her composure and behaved with dignity. The lady said with a smile that this was thanks to her instructions. The Viscountess stated that there were a few glitches, but since she did not have to dance, the party should go off without a hitch. Wilhelmina knew she didn't have a partner, but she knew it was for the best. At that very moment, Madame began to talk about their next step in their studies, but suddenly she began to cough violently. Wilhelmina looked at Madame in surprise, as she did not understand what was wrong with her because she was pale. The madam sighed heavily and told the lady that she would tell her everything now. Wilhelmina was taken aback and said that if the training could be done in your presence, she could do it sitting down. Madame looked at her in surprise, but still agreed. A moment later, the young lady helped her mentor approach a small sofa. At that very moment, she approached the small table as she wanted to give something to Madame. A moment later, the madam asked the lady in surprise what she had given her. Wilhelmina said with a smile that there was a small stone inside, and since it was hot, she wanted to put it in her handkerchief. The madam asked with surprise why the lady had given her something like that. Wilhelmina came closer to her mentor and said that her hands were cold. Wilhelmina saw that during the training, Madame took off her gloves several times and rubbed her hands. She knew it was typical of people with their cold hands. She could have simply taken off her gloves, but since her manners were so impeccable, it meant she strictly followed etiquette. A few moments later, the madam thanked the lady with a smile for such care. Madame declared that it was a very unusual hand warmer. The lady said that the stone was brought by a servant, and she only wrapped it in cloth. The madam asked if the lady had actually bought this fabric. Wilhelmina said with a smile that this was not so, and she sewed it herself. The Viscountess was surprised and asked the lady if she had really done something like that for the servants. Wilhelmina said with a smile that it was true and that it was not difficult at all. At the elementary school learning center, she had to do all sorts of things. And sometimes she would mend clothes for children who had fallen or embroider names on shoe bags. Wilhelmina: I told her that as autumn was drawing to an end, the children began to complain that it was too cold for them to wash their clothes. So she made one bag each, but ended up sewing 20 of them. The Viscountess was surprised to hear this, and at the same time she noticed that the lady had skillful hands. Wilhelmina asked if everyone could do this, and Madame said that embroidery was part of education, But not everyone could use such skills for the sake of servants. A moment later, Madame took off her gloves and began to warm her hands. The Viscountess looked in surprise at the tea, which was with ginger and dried fruits. She asked the lady if she had really selected such ingredients herself. The lady stated that this was so and asked the teacher to drink the tea before it got cold, that ginger was quite expensive. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she doesn't like the cold. She said that in the western lands, the climate was colder than in the capital, and even autumn felt like winter. Wilhelmina looked at Madame with a smile and said that it was easy to tell from her clothes how cold she felt. She smiled and also stated that she didn't like the cold either. Wilhelmina couldn't imagine what it was like to lose a husband, but at least she understood the cold. For this reason, she just wanted to warm up Madame with something small. A few minutes later, Madame stated that she would like to sum up their training in a few days. The Viscountess said with a smile that she had been teaching young ladies etiquette for several decades. How to hold a fan correctly. Which hand should you leave free when walking with a man? What drinks you can drink, and what foods you should not eat. Wilhelmina looked at Madame with bewilderment, as she was supposed to announce the results of the training. Madame stated that after spending many years in this field, she realized that true learning cannot be conveyed through words alone. Wilhelmina looked at her mentor with a smile, as she understood what she was getting at. Wilhelmina, in turn, remembered how she often chased after students. She quarreled with them every time and made a remark to them. The Viscountess, looking at the ladies, said that everyone said that she taught manners, but in fact, she would like to teach them to be an example for other aristocrats. She wanted to speak about the duty and dignity of those who stood above. Wilhelmina asked Madame if she was sure she could get up already. At that very moment, the Viscountess approached the young lady. She looked at the lady with a tender smile. The Viscountess said with a smile that, in this sense, the Duchess lacked nothing. Madame declared that the lady had a way of thinking which she was not able to teach. She said that she had been observing her good deeds for several days. She watched the expressions on the faces of the maids who served her. She saw the onion-faced looks watching her from the door with concern as she scolded the lady. The madam said with a smile that the lady possessed the most important qualities a lady should possess. So that was the end of their training. After some time, the young lady learned that only 40 nobles would be at the celebration. Considering the status of the Margrave, this is a surprisingly small number of people. The Margrave's line is as ancient as the ducal house. The Margrave was a knight respected by the military, but the young lady did not understand why such events were held in such a small circle. But recently, the Viscountess informed her that officially, the Western lands were still in mourning. She knew that the word meant that no one actually thought that way. Less than 2 months had passed since the late Duke's death, but judging by the fact that no one observed mourning, his popularity seemed to leave much to be desired. However, she herself had only worn mourning for a week, when widows had to wear black for several years. And she also saw that Helena was holding up well. She knew that the Duchess had a hard time because her father-in-law already had 5 wives, so the lady wanted to set a worthy example, like a mother-in-law. So she intended not to interfere in anything, because she knew that when the elders interfered, things only got worse. A moment later, all her thoughts vanished as the maid called her. Wilhelmina said with a smile that the party would soon begin, so it was time for them to go. Sometime later, the young lady was at the party. She looked into the distance and noticed the Duke, but she saw that he was much younger than she expected. Wilhelmina saw that instead of the head of an ancient family, he looked more like the CEO of a startup. She had heard that Leighton was a clan that had once broken away from the imperial family, and she knew that even his hair showed that. It's ironic that her first official meeting with her stepson took place at someone else's party. And besides, accepting a stepmother who was younger than him, even for a person from the modern world, was not easy. She assumed he would feel repulsed by her. A moment later, the Duke came closer to her and greeted her with a smile, calling her mother. Wilhelmina froze in shock, as she had not expected anything like this at all. He greeted her with a smile and introduced himself. She was taken aback by his greeting, but in turn did not forget to introduce herself, although she only gave her first name. The Duke, with a joyful smile, added their surname to hers. Wilhelmina was very puzzled, but still added her last name to her first name and said that she was glad to meet him. She didn't understand what was happening, and it seemed to her that this was more like a class leader welcoming a new student than meeting her stepmother. For a moment, she looked at him, puzzled, as he glowed with happiness. The Duke said with a smile that, given the circumstances, he wanted to apologize for not being able to show her the hospitality she deserved. She hadn't felt such intense friendliness in a long time. But in turn, she said with a smile, that there was nothing wrong with it because he was busy. He said that he had previously told his wife that he should have said hello first, but she said that she needed time to get used to it. He said with a smile that this was the reason he could not come. She was puzzled, as she thought that such things did not need to be mentioned. Wilhelmina understood that one might think from the outside that he was slandering his wife. She knew that at such moments they usually looked at the butler's reaction. But when she did something like this, she realized that it was useless. She knew that there was no talk of any period of adaptation, and this was the most direct hint that she did not need to tease the geese any further. The Duke looked at the lady with a smile and said that he was very glad to see her in good health. He asked if she was living comfortably in the estate. She said with a smile that she had lived without any particular problems. At the same time, the young lady understood that she should not give in to his mood. The Duke said he was worried that the place where she lived was far away. Michael said with a smile that if she wanted, she could move to their main castle. She blocked his blow and declared that she liked the place. She was already disgusted when people looked at her from behind the scenes, so she didn't even want to meet Helena. She understood that if she moved to the main castle, they would have a new series of battles, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. She sighed heavily as she realized that this was like the beginning of a reality show about divorces, and it was clear to her that in the end, she would just end up as the villain. At that very moment, the Duke looked at the lady as if he wanted to tell her something, but the butler intervened in their conversation and announced that everything was ready for the reception. Wilhelmina was glad that he intervened in their conversation. At that moment, the Duke looked at the lady with a smile and invited her to go. He called her mother with a smile, but for some time, the lady hesitated to take his hand. But at the same time, she understood that she was replacing Helena, so she needed to fulfill her role properly. After some time, the man announced all the guests present. At that very moment, the Count approached the young people and greeted them. For some time, they engaged in casual conversation among themselves. Wilhelmina understood that, most likely, she would have to just stand there like a mannequin and repeat the same phrases over and over again. She assumed that everyone was talking behind her back. Without looking at the situation in the hall, the young man continued to announce the guests. Wilhelmina, looking at everyone present, noticed that the aristocrats were no different from ordinary people. A moment later, the Viscount entered the hall with his daughter. Wilhelmina was glad that the last nobleman had finally entered, and she noticed that he had come with his daughter. But after a moment, the lady noticed the girl, as she was wearing very high heels. She also noticed that the girl's corset was too tight, and on top of everything else, she was wearing an off-the-shoulder dress, which she assumed was to make the baby look seductive. At that very moment, the Viscount looked at his daughter and told her to walk more evenly. Wilhelmina looked at the man with fury, as he was simply mocking his daughter. At that very moment, they approached and bowed in greeting before the Duke. Wilhelmina was puzzled and did not understand how the girl could greet someone with such a corset. This worried Wilhelmina greatly, and a moment later, she saw that the girl had become ill. After some time, the young lady woke up in a place unknown to her. She was taken aback and wondered what she had done at the reception. But a moment later, she saw the widowed duchess standing before her. Wilhelmina looked closely at the girl and stated that she had been vomiting for a long time. She also asked if she was feeling better now. Irina was taken aback, as she remembered everything in general terms. Wilhelmina told the girl that she had made soup from well-grated pumpkin, so the girl should eat it. The lady was puzzled. She didn't understand what was happening. Wilhelmina looked closely at the Viscount and declared that the child was dizzy, and therefore she intended to take care of her herself. The Viscount was taken aback and said that she did not need to bother so much. She looked at him menacingly and said that he should go and enjoy the reception. At the same time, she saw how everyone was looking at her and had already begun to whisper. The Duke looked at his mother with surprise, as he had expected something similar from her. At that very moment, he told the butler to call the doctor and take the girl to the restroom. The young lady was taken aback, as she understood that this was a disgrace for her. Wilhelmina calmly stated that there was no need for a doctor and that the butler could simply bring warm water with honey. Wilhelmina looked at one girl with a gentle smile and declared that everything was fine and she could relax, as everything would soon settle down. The young lady was amazed by such warmth. At that very moment, Wilhelmina apologized to those present for the commotion and announced that she would be leaving for a short while. At that very moment, she looked menacingly at everyone and declared that since this was a reception in honor of the governor of the border zone, it was worth congratulating him properly. But she put a rude subtext into her words, that everyone present should not then gossip about the child behind his back, and that they should mind their own business. At the same time, the young lady was filled with shame because she did not know what to do now. She looked intently at Wilhelmina, because from a distance she seemed to her like a stern lady, but up close she was quite soft. A moment later, the young lady began to pour tea. She enjoyed every smooth sip of the wonderful drink with a smile. Wilhelmina said with a smile that the drink contained excellent honey. Irina enjoyed every sip with a smile, while feeling the lady's warmth and care. But a moment later, her expression darkened as she realized that if she ate too much sweets, she would gain weight. At that very moment, she stopped, and the lady asked her if she didn't like the drink. Irina said with a smile that she liked everything, but at the same time she felt awkward about her hospitality. Wilhelmina looked closely at the girl as she understood that something was wrong. Wilhelmina smiled warmly and declared that the girl should drink it all. Wilhelmina saw that the young lady was not reaching for the drink, so Anna said again that the lady should drink it all. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, and at that very moment approached the girl. She looked intently at Irina and asked her not to move, while she began to unlace the corset at the back. The young lady was embarrassed, as this was a shock to her. At that very moment, she turned around and asked the lady not to do such a thing. Irina was frightened and did not know what the Duchess was planning. She wondered if Madame had any secret hobbies. Wilhelmina sighed heavily as she realized that the hooks in the front were also unfastening. The young lady became even more and more embarrassed, but at the same moment the channel was taken aback and declared that in this position, her belly would stick out. Wilhelmina looked closely at the girl and stated that if something else were to get in the way later, they could loosen it from behind as well. Irina was in shock because she knew that she was not married yet, and she could not just sit in the room with naked skin. At that very moment, Wilhelmina threw a small cape over the girl. She looked intently at Irina and declared that no one would come into their room and that she didn't need to worry. After which, with a smile, she offered the girl a drink of soup before it got cold. And now that her corset was unfastened, she felt much better. The young lady was very surprised, but she still saw that she could breathe much easier. She was excited because she even had to sleep in the corset. And now that she took it off, she could breathe easier and her stomach did not hurt. Irina sadly stated that the corset could not be unfastened because she had been told that until she got married, it had to be worn to keep her waist thin. Wilhelmina declared about the girl that if she broke it off just a little, nothing would happen. Irina understood that if she drank the soup, she might gain weight. But at that very moment, the young lady said with a smile that she would not gain weight, so she did not need to worry. Irina wanted to object and ask why Wilhelmina behaved this way towards her, but she could not utter a word. So without further ado, she began to crucify the drink. At that very moment, she looked at Madame with a tender smile, as she was pleased with such care. Wilhelmina looked closely at one girl and stated that she did not want to give unnecessary advice, but she still should change her corset to a looser one. At that very moment, Irina declared that this was the most popular model. Wilhelmina sternly told the girl that she would not become beautiful simply by cutting off everything that others did. Wilhelmina asked Irina. Noticed Lita how she looked now. Irina looked at herself in surprise. At that very moment, she was taken aback because she realized that the makeup on her chest had come off. She apologized and said that she would quickly fix everything. Wilhelmina said that it was not at all a matter of her having everything whitewashed. She asked the girl if she had a stomachache. The young lady sheepishly stated that she was not in any pain. Wilhelmina told Irina that she was lying, and if she wore a corset every day, she probably became constipated. The young lady was shocked, as she knew that such things were not said out loud by ladies. Wilhelmina asked if she was ashamed, and she also asked menacingly if she was ashamed that she almost threw up at the reception, where everyone was looking at her. At that moment, the young lady's face sank, as she could not answer. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, because she understood that she wanted to be more beautiful than everyone else, but she couldn't sacrifice her health for this. Irina, embarrassed and timid, stated that her father had said that she needed to be even slimmer. Wilhelmina asked the girl if she was really going to marry her father, and shouted that she would marry her fiancé. Wilhelmina asked if he really couldn't stand the bride anymore. Irina shouted that her fiancé hadn't said anything like that. Wilhelmina was glad that at least her fiancé was a completely reasonable person, because Irina was supposed to live with him, so she did not understand why she was tormenting herself. At that very moment, the young lady shouted that the studio did not have a size larger than this dress. With tears in her eyes, she said that even though she was plump, she managed to eat cake at the debutante ball. Wilhelmina looked menacingly at the girl as she realized that someone had said something to her. Irina was taken aback and stated that she had been told that she was just a provincial noblewoman, who, however, was not embarrassed to eat a lot at her own ball. After their words, she felt sick every night because of the tightly tightened corset. As soon as she walked in high shoes, her feet began to hurt, and she really wanted to erase the memories that were given to her at the ball. She knew it sounded childish, but because of one evil rumor, she was now almost embarrassed at the reception. Wilhelmina looked closely at the girl and asked if it had been hard for her. She wanted to know if this was the reason Irina didn't want to drink the soup. Irina said that it was so, and even if she ate when she was hungry, the food looked disgusting. Wilhelmina said it wasn't disgusting, and she didn't think it was strange or ugly. She knew the food wasn't a mistake. Irina understood this, but still others said different words. Wilhelmina looked at the girl tenderly and stated that they were alone in the room. She looked at her intently and declared that no one would know what they talked about. Wilhelmina told the girl that if she eats something tasty without harming her health and smiles at the same time, it will not harm her at all. She said that a girl shouldn't think that food is disgusting. Wilhelmina tenderly wiped away the young lady's tears and declared that she could eat in peace and that it would be their little secret. A moment later, Irina smiled and said words of gratitude to Madame. Wilhelmina looked at the girl with a satisfied smile, as she was glad about her change. Wilhelmina looked closely at the lady, as she understood that relationships between people of the same age were not an easy thing. Teenage relationships carried a weight different from adult life, and one moment of difference could turn into a lifelong nightmare for a child. She knew from experience that trying to rush into the souls of such children would not bring any benefit. After all, she was an adult and could not really interfere with the community in which the lady lived. A moment later, Irina was taken aback as she realized that her corset was not fastened. Wilhelmina noticed that it was already late, and the reception should have ended. Irina looked at the lady with a smile and declared that she was a match. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, as in the end she did not return to the hall as she had planned, although she understood that she would have to listen to reproaches from her daughter-in-law. A moment later, she handed the young lady honey and herbs that aided digestion. Irina thanked her with a smile for this and asked if she could come to her again. Irina wanted to come to her not for a reception, but as a visit. She shyly asked if they could see each other in person again. Wilhelmina, in turn, did not know whether she had the right to invite guests. She understood that there was a lot of gossip about her among the nobility, but a moment later she remembered how she had told the viscountesses that in society, it was customary to organize various gatherings, and she could also do something like that. The viscountess said the lady could have organized a literary circle or a tea party. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, as she was not particularly fond of reading. Madame said that in reality, reading was not necessary, since the purpose of such meetings was to establish connections. She asked in surprise if this was really a way to make friends. The madam looked at the lady intently and stated that she needed to secure the support of her allies. Wilhelmina knew that high society was also part of the human world, and, in other words, it was just another battlefield drowning in mud. A moment later, she told the girl that she didn't know when exactly, but she was going to hold literary circles regularly. With shining eyes, she asked Madame if she would also invite her to the circle. She joyfully shouted that she simply couldn't believe that she would become the first member of the circle. She said with a smile that she was very glad about this, and therefore thanked the lady. Wilhelmina, looking at Irina, declared that she had not gone to the reception, and if she told her father that she had insisted on it, he would understand. Irina smiled and said that Madame had helped her, so she would tell her father how everything really happened. She knew that the lady had only momentarily cared for the girl, who was almost sick. After some time, the young lady watched the girl closely. She saw that Irina was worried about her father. Then she realized that her father was not such a bad person. Although she was angry with him because he allowed his daughter to reach such a state, Wilhelmina was a little puzzled, as she sometimes didn't understand family relationships in this world. After some time, she returned to the hall. Wilhelmina called the boy and asked where the Duke was now. The boy stated that the Duke had gone into the courtyard with the guests, and they were drinking there. She realized that the second part of the feast took place in the garden of the Duke's house, and she understood that they drank under the moon and felt carefree. She understood that the governor had already arrived, and she needed to greet him. After some time, the young lady regretted that she had sent the servant, as she did not really know the ducal estate, and she had the impression that she had been wandering for a long time. But at that very moment, she noticed a beautiful lake. She wanted to take a little walk before the meeting, but at that very moment, she noticed that someone had already arrived before her. Looking closer, she saw a large man. Judging by his build, it was clear that he was a warrior, even despite his festive attire. She knew that Irina and her father were the last guests, and she had not seen such a person at the reception. At that very moment, the young lady assumed that the person in front of her was the governor. She wanted to say hello to him, but after a moment, she noticed that there was someone else next to him. The tree was hiding the young man, so she couldn't see him. It seemed to her that he appeared out of nowhere. She noticed the unusual clothing, as well as the unusual pattern on the fabric, and she assumed that this outfit was of Eastern origin. At the same time, the young lady wondered who it could be. She wanted to know the person who communicated with the governor. The man asked his companion if he wanted to meet the man, as he had been waiting for this for a long time. But the young man said that now was not the time. The young lady was puzzled because she had accidentally overheard someone else's conversation, and she didn't know what to do. The man wanted to know when the time would come, and so he asked his companion if he still didn't want to meet because of that strange collection of rumors. The young man said that it was not so. The man said that the most terrible people were those who were fixated on one thing. He was puzzled by the collection of poems because he bought it and realized after reading it that it was written by a complete layman in love. The young lady was surprised that they were talking about this topic, since the topic was certainly a bit unusual for two healthy men to discuss. She understood that simply leaving, pretending that she had not heard anything, was also not an option, since she had business with the Margrave. The man stated that from the very beginning, all the chaos happened because of one thing. The young man stated that he had already said several times that he did not want to get closer in this way. She understood that before the conversation ended, it would be better for her to leave. But to her regret, she stepped on a twig and thus exposed herself. At that very moment, the men looked away warily. Wilhelmina instantly found herself in the men's sight. At that very moment, the Count greeted the Duchess and introduced himself. She realized that she had unintentionally interrupted their conversation, so she had no other choice. At that very moment, she greeted the Count. She saw before her the famous border ruler of the West and the idol of swordsmen. As expected from him, there was an aura about him that she had not felt from anyone she had met before. But after a moment, she turned her gaze to the young man who had hidden his appearance. Wilhelmina stared at the man for a moment as he spoke confidently for several minutes, and now stood frozen like a statue. She apologized for not being able to attend such a noble celebration, as urgent circumstances had arisen. The Count stated that he had heard of her circumstances, and that as the organizer of this reception, he was simply doing his duty. He stated that she did not need to worry about such things, and the young lady thanked him with a smile for his understanding. At that very moment, she asked who the gentleman was who was hiding behind the knight's vestments. The Count immediately declared warily that this was his acquaintance. She was surprised because he tried to hide the person behind him, so it seemed to her that they did not want to reveal his identity. She understood that it would be better for her not to interfere, because nothing good would come out of it. But at that very moment, she said that she heard that a feast was planned. The Count stated that this was so, but he did not drink alcohol. But of course he was invited, and he intended to attend. She asked in surprise if he really didn't like alcohol. The Count stated that it was not that simple. It was his wife's request. She saw that he was a very caring man, but she also realized that the large man still became soft in front of his wife. Wilhelmina saw that even his face changed a little when he spoke about his husband. He asked if she had planned to join the feast in the inner palace. She smiled and stated that it was not so, and she had come to such a place only to see him, and since they had met, it was time for her to return. At that very moment, the Count declared that the Duke had been looking for her some time ago. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she understood perfectly well where her presence was not required. She knew that this dinner was most likely just a meeting with the closest people, and the hostess of the house should participate in it. But the Count was surprised by her words. But at that very moment, he declared that he understood her. Wilhelmina looked at the Count in surprise, as he was angry about something. She didn't understand what was happening, and looking at the young man, she noticed that the atmosphere had suddenly changed. At that very moment, the Count wished the young lady a pleasant evening. Coming closer, he stated that he would like to accompany her. Wilhelmina smiled and said that he need not worry, as she would call the servants on the way. At that moment, she bowed and wished them a good evening. The Count was taken aback and, asking for forgiveness, asked if he could ask her a question. Wilhelmina looked at him in surprise and said that she was listening to him. He asked her if she had ever had a man with whom she had been romantically involved. She was taken aback and looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he had just asked. Wilhelmina thought he was a family man, but she wondered if it was just a flirtation. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness and declared with a smile that she was not interested in married men. The Count was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. At that very moment, he cried out that she had misunderstood everything, and that he loved his wife very much. The young lady froze for a moment as he came very close to her. He apologized for his tactlessness and immediately pulled away from her. A moment later, he glanced sideways at his companion. He sighed heavily, because everyone said that he was a peculiar person, and it was true. The lady looked at him in surprise, as she had not heard what he had said. But at that very moment, the Count declared that he had simply voiced his thoughts out loud. He looked closely at the lady and asked if she had studied at the academy. Wilhelmina looked at him in surprise and stated that it was so. The Count sighed and asked if she would believe him if he told her that someone she had met was waiting for her there now. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She wondered who she had met at the academy. She didn't understand who was still waiting for her. The young man looked at her intently, waiting for her answer. Wilhelmina looked at the Count with a smile, not knowing what to answer him. But a moment later, she apologized and stated that she was not interested in new religious movements. The Count was taken aback and froze with bewilderment on his face. At that very moment, he sheepishly asked her for forgiveness and asked her not to make fun of him. She realized that he was caught, but at the same moment, she declared that she had not had any romantic relationships at the academy. She had only a few close friends, but after graduation, she lost contact with them, which was not surprising, since immediately after graduation, she rushed to look for a job. She also stated that all the others were nobles and had gone to their family estates, that during their studies, she had no time for romance, nor after, that the Count said that this was very strange. He asked in surprise if she had never received a confession of feelings. She smiled and said that perhaps he had confused her with someone else. The Count said that this was not so, and that it was unlikely that another such peculiar person existed. Wilhelmina looked at him with fury, as she realized that he had called her strange. The Count glanced sideways at his companion and stated that, listening to her, it seemed as if she had been rejected after her confession. He assumed that he had simply imagined something different. She sighed and stated that she had no such connections. He said that it was very strange and asked if she had never even received a declaration of love. Wilhelmina said she also found it surprising because she thought she would be a success. But alas, although she had plenty of self-confidence, he looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and asked what was wrong, and at that moment he realized that she was just making fun of him. If she had known that everything would turn out this way, she would have studied better and harder. But still, she couldn't stop thinking about the man in the helmet, because all this time he was watching her. She wondered if she really was that curious. Wilhelmina understood that if she were in their place, she would also look at it that way, because she was younger than her daughter-in-law, and this was an absurd drama. A moment later, she approached her house and was taken aback. The young lady was surprised because she saw a maid with a little girl. She asked in surprise what they were doing on the steps, and at that very moment, they happily rushed towards her. Marina ran to the elder lady with a joyful smile, as she was glad that she had returned. Anna was alarmed that her mistress came alone, because it was dangerous. Wilhelmina said with a smile that there was nothing to be afraid of since they were in the castle, but she still wanted to know what they were doing in a place like that so late at night. Anna stated that they were worried about when the elder lady would return. Marina said that Anna was worried that the elder lady might get hurt. At that very moment, Anna rushed to the girl and tried to close her mouth so that she wouldn't blurt out anything unnecessary. She looked at the girl intently and asked when she had ever said anything like that. Wilhelmina looked at the maid with a smile because she realized that she thought that the nobility might ignore her, and that was why she was very worried. She thanked Anna with a smile for her worries, but nothing happened. At that very moment, the maid breathed a sigh of relief. A moment later, they were heading back to the mansion, with the young lady remarking that the elder lady looked magnificent. She saw the beautiful dress that had been sent from the ducal mansion, but her modest powers of eloquence did not allow her to express its magnificence. She sighed heavily as she realized that Helena had actually paid attention to this. Wilhelmina knew she wasn't to her liking, but since she had prepared an outfit that befitted her status as the eldest duchess in this, her pride in her family was felt. Wilhelmina immediately noticed that the outfit was truly beautiful. The young lady said with a smile that the elder lady was beautiful, and she was more beautiful than any dress, for she shone like a star in the night sky. Wilhelmina thanked the girl for the compliment with a smile and suggested that they go inside and drink a cup of hot milk and then go to bed. Anna said with a smile that she would prepare everything. Wilhelmina smiled and asked her to prepare some cups as she wanted to drink milk with them. She smiled and agreed with the lady. The ballroom was luxurious, and the castle next door was majestic, but still, the best was where she lived. After some time, the count returned back to the castle. He glanced sideways at his companion and asked if he was nervous. The young man sighed heavily and stated that it was so. The man who had not flinched in the face of hundreds of enemies could now hardly breathe in front of one woman. The count sighed heavily and asked the young man why he didn't just take off his helmet and say hello properly. He stated that he had not expected such a meeting at all. The count wonders whether this is stubbornness or excessive devotion. He knew that whatever the situation on that side, it seemed that the woman named Wilhelmina was living quite well. She showed no signs of fatigue from family conflicts. On the contrary, she held herself confidently, as if she were the mistress of the house. The count told his companion that he supported him as a token of gratitude for the help he had provided, but he should not overdo it. The count said that the young man must remember that he could not leave his place for long. At that very moment, the young man took off his helmet and thanked the count for his advice. The count looked at the young man intently and declared that if Jake saw him in such a state, he would be greatly disappointed. He smiled and stated that there was no other way to get in. The count asked what the young man was going to do now, since he was here by invitation and planned to meet with their duke. The young man declared that he was leaving, because he had come to congratulate the count, and not to bring discord into his family. The count thought for a moment, as he realized that the duke hardly thought so. At that very moment, the young man announced that it was time for him to leave, and he also said that there was no need to see him out. The count understood that it would be wonderful to share the cup of wine with him, but since he had come, he would have to let him go. At that very moment, he bowed and said goodbye to the young man. As he left, the young man looked menacingly at the count and declared that he should check the conditions in which the young lady lived. He wanted the count to report everything to him immediately, and the count bowed in agreement. The next day, the young lady met with Johann, and she asked him if, in his opinion, the most successful trading guild now was Goldrail. Johann, eating delicious potatoes, declared that this was true, because they really did have absolutely everything. She knew that this was a new trading company that had only recently received a noble title. For ordinary people, they sold all sorts of small things, and for the nobles, they supplied food and spices. She remembered how, in her past life, her student said that everything might not go according to plan after reincarnation, and she would need money. In general, she agreed with this statement because now she could only count on the support of the Duke. but she did not know what would happen next. She was not fit to use the ideas of modern scientific knowledge and culture because she was a layman in applied science. At that moment, she looked at the boy and asked if there was any interesting news about the guild. He stated that a girl was selling flour there. Wilhelmina was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that there was a shop where they sold flour, salt, and sugar, and the owner's name was Jane, and the girl was really unusual. She was the youngest in his family, but she seemed to have huge ambitions, as she came up with original advertising to sell more goods. She also held sugar tastings, so people could experience the taste of sugar, but the sugar itself was very expensive. As a result, the head office sent an employee to stop this tasting, and she was terribly angry with him. Wilhelmina thought about the girl for a moment, as she was a stubborn and determined youngest daughter in a family of newly rich people. She realized that this was the ideal candidate, but she didn't expect that the right person would be found so quickly. At that very moment, she stroked the boy's head with a smile, thereby praising him. Wilhelmina knew that inventing something on her own was not easy, but by combining local technologies and the conveniences of her world, a wonderful product could be created. Wilhelmina, in turn, wanted to recruit her at any cost. A moment later, she wrote a short note and asked the boy if he could give it to her. He asked in surprise if she was really planning to start a business. She knew that she needed to make connections first, but she said with a smile that she should try everything possible. He was surprised, but still wished her luck. Wilhelmina thanked him with a smile for his support and stroked his head again. At the same moment, the boy announced that it was time for him to go and tend the garden, and she asked if they could go together. Johann asked her in surprise where she wanted to go. She smiled and said that she needed to see the Duchess. At that moment, the boy was taken aback and froze in shock. But she smiled and said that he didn't need to worry. Wilhelmina knew that since her relatives had asked for a meeting early in the morning, it meant the matter was truly important. She understood that the topic was already clear, and the incident that happened at the reception. She understood that they had a lot of questions, but at the same time, she wished that she would have been the one to bear all the disapproval. She knew that then the gossip about Irina would die down, because slander tends to concentrate on one person. She knew that if the Duchess began to express dissatisfaction after this, she would simply apologize. Wilhelmina entered the room and was taken aback for a moment. She looked at the spouses in surprise. At that very moment, the Duke asked Madame to sit down, but he also asked his wife to soften her expression since they had not gathered to quarrel. The Duke said with a smile that the three of them were finally together as a family. Michael asked with a smile what kind of tea he should make her, since he intended to brew it himself. She was shocked and did not expect that the Duke would personally brew tea for the self-proclaimed hostess. She saw that even his wife looked at her as if she wanted to kill her. She looked intently at the Duke and realized that she had not been mistaken in thinking that his head was all flowers. She remembered how a student said that in such novels, the main antagonist was not a villain at all, but was one type of person that everyone tried to avoid. Looking at the Duke, she understood what her student was talking about. She saw in the Duke a truly naive simpleton, but she understood that she would not be able to avoid the most unpleasant character. When she first saw the Duke at a festive reception, she thought he was only pretending to be a simpleton, but now she was sure that he was like that on his own. Wilhelmina was puzzled, as he did not understand the hints at all, was overly optimistic, and irritated to the point of correctness. She saw that he didn't even realize how stupid he looked from his wife's side when he took his mother-in-law's side. And for her, this situation was extremely awkward. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she would like to talk a little. The Duke smiled and said that they had something to talk about. She did not want to talk to him, but wanted to talk to Helena. At that very moment, he announced with a smile that they were going to move to a separate wing. She was shocked and begged him to stop, as she did not want him to provoke his wife even more. Wilhelmina said that there was no need to go to the separate wing, because there were too many curious eyes there. She could have come herself. The Duke asked with a smile if this was true. She sighed heavily but said nothing. At that very moment, she looked at the Duchess as she noticed that her face had thawed, at least a little. Wilhelmina realized that the lady was making it clear that there was no need to observe formalities. Wilhelmina said that if it wasn't urgent, they could just write a letter, as they had a lot to worry about. The Duke said with a smile that they were one family and could not limit themselves to correspondence. He asked how about Togo, so that once a week sadness. The young lady was shocked. She saw that he was up to his tricks again, but she didn't want anything like that. Helena asked her husband to slow down a bit, saying that she would like to talk to her mother about the recent reception. The Duke understood everything, and at that very moment asked whether he should go out. He wanted them to talk calmly, but Helena did not answer him, and a moment later turned to her mother, for she had heard of the lady from the Viscount's family. Wilhelmina sighed heavily, as she had expected the conversation to be on a similar topic. At the same moment, she declared that it was just a small confusion. Helena understood this, but because of her, the lady did not attend the festive reception held in honor of the Count. Wilhelmina waited until the moment of exit, but in the end, she was not even able to properly congratulate the Count. So, in fact, it can be considered that she really did not come. Helena looked at the lady intently, collecting her thoughts. A moment later, she handed her a small letter, and the lady saw that it was unopened. Helena stated that it was a letter of thanks from the lady and the Viscount's family. She realized that they had not read the contents because usually such letters were checked. Helena stated that the lady acted wisely, because for Irina, this was her first public appearance after her debut ball. And if she had made a mistake at the celebration, it would have been a stain on her reputation. Helena looked menacingly at the lady and declared that the mistress of the ducal house did not show up for the reception, which could also be called a sad circumstance. The Duke would have started to say something, but Wilhelmina stopped him and stated that Helena had not finished speaking yet. At that very moment, Helena said that she would like to ask her to take care of the preparations for the next appointment. Wilhelmina looked at her in surprise, as she had not expected anything like this at all. Helena stated that they were talking about a reception that was being organized in honor of the border knights and soldiers of the Margrave. After all, the recent celebration had been arranged specifically for him, but the next one would be dedicated to his troops, and she realized that her absence from the reception could be seen as disrespect for the troops. She understood that Helena wanted to give her a chance to fix it. They wanted to throw dust in her eyes and stop the gossip in society. The lady understood that it would be difficult to refuse something like this. At the same time, Helena looked at her intently, waiting for an answer. After a moment, she smiled and said that she would take care of it. She knew that she had to fix the situation since she had caused everyone inconvenience. Helena said that the location and budget had already been decided, so she intended to inform her about the dates. Wilhelmina sighed heavily and agreed with her. At that very moment, the Duke, with a radiant smile, asked if they would like to have tea. He smiled and said that he would order refreshments for tea. Wilhelmina was furious and wanted him to stop. At that very moment, Helena announced that she had prepared a herbal tea that would be useful for colds. Helena asked her mother to have tea with them before leaving. At that very moment, the Duke asked his wife to leave all her worries behind, as he himself would like to look after them. Wilhelmina looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not understand how he managed to run the house with such a character. She understood that even if Helena was a genius, Michael was still the official head of the family. Looking at his open, carefree face, one became worried about the future of the family, because it seemed that he never seriously worried about anything. She recalled how her student used to say that the simpleton was usually a cool character, but the simpleton was a burden and an optimist who got in everyone's way. She knew that his character had a reason, because he was popular among the servants. A moment later, they heard a knock on the door. The butler apologized for interrupting their conversation, but a letter had arrived that he needed to read. The Duke bowed to his mother with a smile and said that it was time for him to go, but he hoped that the two of them would have fun without him. He said goodbye to his wife with a smile, as he was leaving on business, but he promised to return. A few minutes later, Wilhelmina noticed with a smile that they had drunk tea, so she wanted to leave. At the same moment, Helena said that Viscountess Roland had praised her very much. Wilhelmina was surprised, since she was clumsy in many things. Helena stated that the lady was still not perfect in matters of etiquette, but her cordial attitude was simply excellent. Wilhelmina thought with a smile that the ginger tea had worked well, so she wanted to buy more of it. At that very moment, the young duchess's face changed, and she looked menacingly at her mother. Wilhelmina was taken aback because she realized that this was an obvious mockery on Helena's part. She understood that this was an open mockery, but for some reason it did not irritate her. She understood that the Duke was not with them, so there was no need to be polite. But looking at the Duchess, one could tell that her words sounded mature. She wondered if the Duchess really wanted her to get angry. At that very moment, the young lady burst out laughing, as all her thoughts were read through and through. She found it funny how Helena pretended not to hate her. In this world, she lived in a child's body, but before she got into the world, she had the chance to see a wide variety of people, especially if you consider that in the modern world, where there is no absolute division by status, everyone has encountered this. She didn't care if she openly hated her, Wilhelmina said with a smile that, as a mother-in-law, she would try not to become arrogant and become a worthy duchess. As she left, she said with a smile that, in the end, conflicts between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law only destroyed family peace. Helena, in turn, did not react to such statements in any way. She had a few more things to do before the New Year's reception, and she intended to meet with Jane. Wilhelmina had a lot of confidence, but she also knew she had to focus on what was in front of her. Jane bowed low and greeted Madame and introduced herself. Wilhelmina greeted the lady with a smile and, in turn, introduced herself according to the rules of etiquette. A moment later, she stated that the weather was cold, so she made tea. She looked at her maid with a smile and sent her away. But before she could step outside the door, the maid bumped into a young man. Wilhelmina looked at the unexpected guest in bewilderment, as he was very tall. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness and quietly left the room. Wilhelmina looked at the young man in surprise and wondered if she had imagined their gazes meeting. Jane said with a smile that it was her messenger. She asked for forgiveness, as she had been researched in advance to tell him to wait somewhere else. Wilhelmina said with a smile that everything was fine and she didn't need to worry. A moment later, the young lady began to drink the drink. But at that very moment, she was taken aback because the taste was unfamiliar. Wilhelmina said with a smile that the drink was made from quince, as it was good for colds. Jane was surprised as she smelled an unusual aroma. Wilhelmina found quince in the food warehouse because Anna had previously shouted that ginger was too expensive and couldn't be used just any time. Jane looked at the lady intently and stated that she had heard that the lady wanted to propose business cooperation. She said her trading company was always open to new opportunities, but she was only a humble, small trader, and she feared it would be difficult for her to live up to the Duchess. Wilhelmina understood that this was a polite but veiled refusal, and she simply did not want to get involved with the aristocrats again. Wilhelmina stated that she had not invited the lady to propose a partnership. She smiled and said that she would like to invest in her business. Jane looked menacingly at the lady and asked if she knew what she was doing. Wilhelmina said with a smile that the lady sold grain and spices. A shop selling grain certainly makes a profit, but unlike shops selling jewelry, fabric, or finery, its income is stable but not astronomical. It's possible to earn money constantly, but it's difficult to get rich overnight. But Jane tried to break that limit by doing all sorts of eccentric advertisements. Wilhelmina saw that the girl had gone too far, because the advertising was not creative and could not have much effect. Wilhelmina, looking at her companion, said that she sold flour at a low price to orphans. She appreciated her kindness, so she wanted to make an investment, even if it was small. It is important to understand that this was not about charity, but about an investment. She really was favorable to it. The young lady sighed heavily and stated that she understood her and therefore would try to live up to her expectations. Wilhelmina said that from the very beginning, she did not expect a large profit. The main thing was that there were no losses and the initial capital was preserved. Jane was surprised by such a statement. She knew that such would happen because the damage was caused to the original capital of the crime. Wilhelmina asked in surprise if such investor-friendly laws existed. A moment later, Jane explained everything to the young lady. When a merchant received an investment from a nobleman, he signed a receipt guaranteeing the safety of the initial capital. If he were to damage these funds, he would not only be sentenced to imprisonment, but the principle of collective responsibility would also apply, with the debt falling even on his descendants. His property was confiscated, his entire family was sent to prison, and he himself was forced to work as a convict for the rest of his life with a brand on his name. Wilhelmina wondered if this wasn't too restrictive on financing, since the initial capital couldn't be touched. Jane stated that this is why trading companies that receive large investments are often referred to as a game of chance, where one's life is at stake. Wilhelmina wondered if they hadn't checked the books properly, since in that case, it would have been easy to falsify the reports. Jane asked in surprise what falsification of accounting statements was. Wilhelmina said with a smile that this was when the trading house falsified financial figures to gain profit. At that moment, Jane was taken aback. She looked closely at the lady and realized that she was no ordinary noblewoman. Wilhelmina was a woman of unusual charm, but in the end, she was just a young aristocrat. Jane didn't want to get involved with aristocrats and get into unnecessary trouble. She just wanted to play along with the aristocrat and get away with it. She was going to pretend that she accepted her investment and then just return the money. But a moment later, she was taken aback when she heard about the falsification of accounting reports and financial manipulation. Wilhelmina said with a smile that this was not the only option, since there was also the reverse falsification of accounting reports. Jane asked in surprise if she really meant a method by which the indicators were intended to be reduced. The lady stated that this was not the case. The indicators were slightly reduced to create the illusion of growth. A moment later, she gave the young lady a small example and asked which trading house she would invest her money in. At that very moment, Jane began to reason. After an immediate response, the lady said with a smile that everything was correct. Jane was surprised by this reasoning. Wilhelmina stated that those who look to the future will invest in a company with gradual growth. For this reason, they were deceived. And it was certainly not just about simple profit. Jane was always amazed at how famous trading houses showed perfect growth. She wanted to know how they managed to get investment in any project they took on. Jane was discouraged and said that if it all failed, they might be considered fraudsters. The lady said that was exactly it, and it was a gamble. She said that if they also have fictitious companies, then they can use double-entry bookkeeping. Jane thanked the lady for the detailed explanation, but asked what an effective company was. Wilhelmina said that they were talking about trading houses that existed only on paper, and she asked if the girl hadn't heard of such things. She claimed that they pretended to be subsidiaries when they were not, or pretended to have assets when they did not. After some time, Jane said goodbye to the lady, but at the same time she asked if she could come to her again. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she was waiting for her. Jane was pleased with this answer and declared that she would visit her more often. Wilhelmina, in turn, received more information than the girl, but she was glad that everything turned out this way. After a moment, she sighed heavily because she knew that it was time for her to take care of the remaining matters, because now she had to act personally. Looking at the weather, she wanted to stay at home, but she understood that a celebration could not be held while sitting at home. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard some noise. She saw that her maid was arguing with a man. Anna shouted that they were not going to go far and they only wanted to use the carriage within the property. The lady asked what had happened. She asked the lady for forgiveness as she was only trying to rent a horse. The man stated that the horses in the outbuilding were thoroughbred racehorses, which the former duke valued most of all. If they wanted to use a horse, they had to get permission from the master. Wilhelmina knew the situation was funny, as she was the mother who had to ask her son's permission to take the horse to leave the house. She understood that the situation was absurd, and she saw that they did not perceive her as a real mistress. At that moment, she sighed and said that they couldn't do anything, and they would have to walk. Anna was in shock. But at that very moment, the young lady stopped her maid and smiled tenderly at her. The lady asked the man if she could at least take a carriage from outside. The man stated that he would immediately call a high-class carriage. Anna was taken aback and stated that something like this could affect her reputation. She knew that. Wilhelmina said with a smile that it was okay, because she would only be out for a short time and no one would notice. She said that a person is more important than a reputation. The man was taken aback and froze for a moment. At that very moment, she looked at the man and asked why she needed to keep horses in the outbuilding that she couldn't even use. She said that she should contact the Duchess and order the stables to be cleaned. And the man was immediately taken aback. She smiled and said that he should move the horses to the main stable, and at the same time, she could change his duties. She tried to provide her subordinates with certain comforts, and this was only possible because they recognized her as the mistress of the house. But if someone took her kindness as a reason to cross the line, that was too much. At that very moment, the man told the lady that she could have used another horse. She asked whose horse he was offering her, and the man, trembling, said that it belonged to the owner. Anna told the lady that this horse was the oldest and cheapest of all. She realized that he didn't want to quit his job, but he didn't intend to respect her either. He, trembling with fear, declared that if something happened to the other horses, his life would be ruined. She smiled and stated that he was right. She respected his dedication to his job, and that was why she was sending him where it would not be disturbed. She said with a smile that he wouldn't have to worry about anything like that. But the man froze with a look of horror on his face. She smiled and asked if she said to send him to prison. He was shocked and did not know what to do. Wilhelmina looked menacingly at the man and declared that he should know that disobeying his master was a much more serious crime than simply not handing over a horse. They left, but at that very moment the man fell to his knees as he realized that everything had turned against him. Looking at the lady, Anna stated that the old man did not even come out for the morning roll call. She said he worked alone, so no one pointed out to him that he slept late. Wilhelmina asked the maid if she really thought that sending him back to the castle was too cruel. Anna shouted that everything was the other way around, and that this was even too lenient a punishment. The young lady smiled and said that it was very good. Anna joyfully shouted to the mistress that she was simply magnificent. The lady was glad that she had disappointed the maid. After some time, they finally arrived at the place. At this point, they froze for a moment, as they saw young, hot men. Wilhelmina looked at the young men in surprise, while Anna was filled with embarrassment. At that very moment, Anna approached her mistress and blocked her entire view. She said that she couldn't look because it was indecent. Wilhelmina noticed her maid's hands and thought that she needed some cream. Then she asked if it was strange to take off her outerwear during training. She said that this was not considered something shameful at all. She understood that this was so, but it was still indecent to look at such a thing. Wilhelmina said with a smile that at least they had something to look at. These words killed the maid, but she could not utter a word. The lady had previously thought that all knights and soldiers were huge brutes, but it seemed that they had different body types. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard someone calling her. At that very moment, she saw the Count, who greeted her and also inquired what had brought her to them. The young lady greeted the Count with a smile and remarked that they had not seen each other for a long time. At that very moment, the Count shouted to his subordinates to return to their work and leave immediately, at which the lady hissed. The Count looked at her in bewilderment, but the young lady only made an innocent expression. After some time, the Count asked in surprise if she really wanted to know what the festive banquet should be like. Wilhelmina said that this was so, and if he had any wishes, she could take them into account. He knew that wine and food were best, as his knights did not like quiet events. She asked if there were any dishes they would like to try. He sighed and stated that he couldn't think of anything really suitable, since his guys preferred barbecue to fine dining. She sighed heavily as she realized that this was indeed not easy. At that very moment, the Count shouted that he knew a man who would be ideally suited to solving such issues. He knew that his manner of speaking was rather straightforward. For this reason, he asked for a little time. The ladies were surprised that the Count did not give orders to the servants. Wilhelmina said with a smile that he seemed to prefer doing everything himself, and she liked that very much. A moment later, the ladies were stunned as they saw the man whom the Count had brought. She looked at the knight in surprise, as she did not expect to see a woman. Wilhelmina looked closely at her maid and asked her to calm down. At that very moment, the knight bowed before the lady and declared that his name was Nata Sonon. He apologized for arriving first on an urgent assignment from the commander. The lady was taken aback and asked the knight to stand up, and she also asked him to accept her apologies for the maid, as she had been very rude. Anna asked for forgiveness because he was very handsome and she thought he was a woman. He said that it was his fault because he had not put himself in order because of the task. He said that they didn't need to apologize. She was burning with shame, and the lady asked him to sit down. At that very moment, Nada declared that he was not a man, and, if one could say so, he had no gender. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that meant he was asexual. Nada said with a smile that this was true because he was a fairy. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew little about this people. They are a people who were said to be born in nature, a rare race that is difficult to meet in the human world. They could have been born from flaming volcanoes, or many in their trees. The essence of their existence is not connected with the body, and therefore, they did not need gender. Therefore, views on them in the scientific community were divided. No one knew whether to consider them a separate race or to classify them as spirits. Wilhelmina looked closely at her companion, since, in her opinion, he was not much different from people. She stated that the Count had recommended him, and it was said that he could express his suggestions about the holiday without any difficulty. He looked at her with indignation. She smiled and said that his frankness seemed to be highly appreciated. She said with a smile that she wanted this holiday to be a success. Wilhelmina said that if he had good ideas, Anna would reward him. He stated that the holiday would be much more fun if it were an event rather than just delicious food and a show. The lady looked at him in surprise, as his idea was very good. Nada said he would like to see events in which soldiers and knights could take part. She understood that instead of the knights simply watching from the sidelines, they should take part in it to make it more fun. She understood that dancing would not do, and he supported her thoughts, since among the knights there might be those who knew how to dance, but among the soldiers, there were no dancers. Wilhelmina asked if they could have some kind of martial arts tournament. He stated that they would enjoy it because they had never had the opportunity to do something like this, especially if they had the opportunity to fight in front of an audience. He knew that anyone who was confident in their abilities always wanted to show them off. She understood that it was fun, but if everything was done as usual, it would not be an exciting enough spectacle. She understood that this event was supposed to make a strong impression, but at that moment, he sighed heavily and announced that, unfortunately, he would not be able to take part. The lady asked in surprise why he was making such a loud statement. He sighed and stated that it was all because of his face. There was no one who could seriously fight with him. She was taken aback and realized that many would say that he used his beauty to distract the enemy. Wilhelmina knew that if this tournament was held among people they knew, there might be disadvantages, such as fighting against a superior. At that moment, she realized that if the reason was in the face, then it could simply be hidden. She wanted everyone to remain anonymous and just show their strength. She knew that they could wear bright masks and dress up beautifully so that it would be uncomfortable not only to fight, but also to watch. Wilhelmina realized that they could do it like in an entertainment program, where everyone had weird nicknames. At the same moment, she asked him with a smile how he liked the idea of a masked tournament. Wilhelmina said with a smile that the anime could have dressed up in fancy costumes, put on masks, and performed under fake names. She knew that it would be difficult to recognize the enemy this way, and they could show their true strength. He was shocked by what he heard. But at that very moment, he grabbed the young lady by the hand and asked her, with delight in his eyes, to definitely hold a similar tournament, because he wanted to show his strength. The young lady was shocked by this reaction. At that very moment, the Count approached them and asked what some of them were talking about that made Nada so excited. The Count was surprised, because it was the first time he had seen him so animated. The lady looked at the Count with a smile, and as he had come at an opportune moment, she said that she would like him to listen to them. After a short story, the Count remarked that their idea was very interesting and unusual. He understood that the masks and stage costumes would of course be uncomfortable, but this was only a one-time event, and he thought it was unlikely that it would turn into a wild spectacle. The lady stated that, just in case, for safety's sake, he could prepare some soldiers in the arena so that they could provide weapons or a first aid kit. The Count declared that they would do so, and at the same moment, he asked his subordinate to organize a working group. Wilhelmina said with a smile that she did not expect the knight to react to her words in such a way. The Count stated that as soon as he heard about the masked tournament, he immediately realized that it was ideal for a knight. While he admired the insight of the Dowager Duchess, Wilhelmina knew that this was most likely due to the outstanding writers on Korean variety shows. The Count said that his subordinate had difficulty establishing cooperation with other knights due to his unusual origin and beautiful appearance. He hoped that this event would help him feel at least a little freer. She was surprised that it was such a big problem. The Count stated that the army was a very strict and disciplined structure, and for those who excelled, service could be difficult. He knew that the knight's term of service was coming to an end, and he needed to find a new master. The lady asked in surprise if knights also retired. The Count stated that an ordinary knight swore a lifelong oath of allegiance to his lord. But in Nada's case, it was different. As a rule, the title of knight is bestowed by the lord himself, but if, like Nada, he received this title for military merit, then after leaving the army, he became a free knight. She knew that freedom was only a word, but in reality, he was more like a wanderer. The title of knight was only valid when he had a master. She asked the count if he wanted Nada to go in search of a new master. The count said that everything was correct. The lady asked about his fighting skills. The count stated that he had simply outstanding skills and was among the best fighters. She knew that the Margrave's army was the most powerful force in the West. She understood that even if he had outstanding skills there, but was never recognized, it could really be offensive to him. The count stated that they would schedule the event for the following weekend, and he also stated that he would accompany the lady. She smiled and thanked him for his concern. Wilhelmina quietly asked the maid if she could call the carriage again. She smiled and said that she would certainly do everything. The count looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked if she really didn't have a carriage. She smiled and stated that there were no free carriages, so she called one from outside. But after this statement, the ladies were taken aback as they saw the count's menacing and angry look. They were shocked. They didn't understand why he was so angry. She knew that her maid was not guilty of anything. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and announced that he would take care of transportation. The count called the knight and asked him to prepare an arietta for the lady. A moment later, the lady looked in surprise at the truly magnificent beauty. They were shocked that he provided as many as 6 horses and a carriage that was a dark color, but it was perfect for the military. Honestly, she didn't want to sit down because from the outside it looked like she was going to war. At that very moment, the young lady said that they could simply call an ordinary carriage, but the count insisted that they get into this particular carriage as he knew that the ride would be comfortable. The young lady simply had no choice, and at that very moment, she accepted his help. At that very moment, the count announced that he was about to set out on a journey and would therefore accompany them. Wilhelmina looked at the count in bewilderment, as it seemed strange to her that he was talking to her in such a friendly manner. She knew that if it weren't for her current status as a duchess, she would probably never have been able to speak to him in her life. The count asked her if she remembered what they had talked about last time. She always looked at him knowingly. And then he started talking about meeting in the garden. She wondered if he wanted to know again if she had had an affair with any man. At that very moment, he asked for forgiveness and asked if she could have forgotten about the conversation. She was surprised because she didn't expect this. The count bowed his head to the lady and declared that he sincerely asked her to forget all his previous words. Wilhelmina was taken aback and declared that she would forget about everything. But after his words, she understood that now she would remember it even more strongly. Anna asked if he was referring to the garden, and he most likely meant the reception. And the lady stated that this was the case. At the same time, the maid was burning with curiosity, as she wanted to know what had happened between them. The lady stated that nothing had happened, and at that very moment she realized that something had happened after all. Wilhelmina again declared that nothing had happened, but at that very moment her face changed. As she approached the mansion, the young lady noticed Helena talking to the groom. Anna was taken aback when she saw the man, and she called him by name. The lady looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not understand who she was talking about, but she stated that she was talking about the groom. She said that she was talking about the same groom who refused to give the horse to the lady. At that very moment, the count was furious. Helena looked at her mother in surprise and called her. Wilhelmina greeted the duchess, and then the count stated that they had discussed preparations for the holiday, and since the lady did not have a carriage, he decided to accompany her personally. The duchess thanked the count for his concern, and the count stated that for a knight, this was a matter of course, since he could not allow a noble lady to travel alone. Wilhelmina, in turn, froze for a moment, not understanding what was happening at all. She turned her gaze to the duchess, as she saw that she remained icy calm. At the same time, she wondered if the count was really angry instead of her. She was shocked and didn't understand why he acted this way. It was not difficult to guess that her position in the ducal house was precarious. But at the same time, she wondered why the great Margrave was helping her. The count looked intently at the lady and declared that it was time for him to go, while he arranged his next meeting with her. She said goodbye to him with a smile. At that very moment, he bowed according to all the rules of etiquette. She knew that, no matter what, even the mayor would not benefit from making enemies in the ducal house. She wondered if it wasn't a problem for him. At that very moment, she turned her gaze to the man, as she expected him to be scolded. But she didn't expect him to look like he was standing on the scaffold. The duchess stated that they would soon prepare a carriage for her, and a horse would be delivered to the stables before the next reception. She asked what would happen to the horses that were in the outbuilding. The Duchess stated that they belonged to the Duke, and she understood that they would find her a horse that would be suitable for her position. At that very moment, the Duchess called her mother. Helena stated that she had heard that the groom had not been performing his duties conscientiously. She said that she was going to punish him accordingly. The man shuddered, as he was afraid of punishment. Helena asked her mother what she thought about this. Wilhelmina looked menacingly at the Duchess and asked what this all meant. Helena stated that she simply wanted to know her opinion on what punishment would be appropriate. Anna looked at them with fear, as the atmosphere between them was tense. At that very moment, the lady asked what his fault was. Helena stated that this was punishment for him leaving the horses of the main estate unattended and not taking care to prepare a horse and carriage for her. She understood that they themselves admitted that the horses did not belong to her, and at the same time, they wanted her to take on the role of the villain and punish the servants. Initially, she was going to solve this by simply transferring him to another position. But if she simply let him go without punishment now, she would lose her authority and status as mistress. She knew she had no influence anyway, and since the horses did indeed belong to the main house, she didn't care. She didn't know whether it was worth fighting for principles over such a trifle. At that moment, the young lady simply looked at the Duchess and said that she would like to ask her something. Wilhelmina asked the Duchess who the groom belonged to. Helena asked her in bewilderment what she meant. Wilhelmina stated that they had to sort this out before deciding what to do. She said that if he was listed among the servants of the outbuilding, the blame for his stubbornness simply fell on her because she had failed to manage the servants. But if he was still a servant of the main house, then that was another question. Helena was taken aback. Wilhelmina stated that if he was a servant of the outbuilding, then the horses he looked after belonged to them. But if it was the other way around, then all the blame would fall on the Duchess. Wilhelmina understood that if she was already losing both the horses and her authority, then instead of punishing the servant, it would be better to show generosity and gain the people's favor. At the same time, she looked intently at the Duchess because she wanted to know what she would do in this situation. She looked intently at the lady and stated that at that moment, she was worried that a quarrel might start. She sighed and stated that it was the first time she had seen the younger mistress so formidable. Wilhelmina knew that the Duchess always gave that impression, but it seemed that she looked different to the servants. The confrontation with the Duchess ended unexpectedly too easily. Since the Duchess had previously stated that it was her mistake and the man would only receive a formal punishment, Wilhelmina sighed heavily, knowing that her horses had been taken away from her after all. Anna stated that the man received a lot from the other grooms. The lady was surprised by this. She said that he was not doing his job well enough as it was, and was also lazy. So they decided to teach him a lesson. A moment later, their conversation was interrupted as they met the knights. Nada greeted the Duchess with a smile, and she noticed that he had brought a bunch of things with him. She asked them to come in with a smile, but I also apologized for not being able to offer them tea in the garden. The knights smiled and said that everything was fine since they had come on duty. She watched them intently for a while. At the same time, she turned her attention to the knight, who was trying to hide his intentions, but everything was written on his face. He asked the young lady, and lady with a smile, what he should do. She smiled and invited him to come in and look at the clothes, and at that moment he beamed with happiness. After some time, they came to a small room. Entering the room, the young lady asked the little workers how they were doing. Everyone present greeted her with a smile. He asked in surprise if these were her servants, and she said with a smile that this was not so, and that they were just children who lived in their estate. He was surprised that the children were making costumes for the event. Wilhelmina stated that they were, and she ordered them. She said it was a charity project in which children who spent a week in a warm room received pay equal to what they could earn in a week of working in the fields. And they could take the remains of the fabric with them, he asked in surprise, wondering if the children could really do their job well. Wilhelmina said that quality doesn't matter. Even if they look ridiculous, there is a charm to that too. Nada asked if it wouldn't harm their reputation. She said that perhaps because of the bright colors and decorations, the costumes would look a bit rustic. But if you add that it was made by children, everyone immediately became cute and charming. Wilhelmina said with a smile that, after all, it was charity, and she asked the knight if he would really condemn such a thing. Nada was extremely amazed by her thoughts. She said that even if it affected the knight's reputation, it would be positive, and he was genuinely amazed by what he heard. She said with a smile that the final finishing would be done by a tailor, so they didn't have to worry about that. He looked at her in amazement and, sighing, said that he understood everything. The lady asked him if he would also like to sit next to the children and help them, and he immediately agreed. A moment later, they both sat down as they intended to begin work. The boy ran up to Wilhelmina, called her sister, and asked if she would also be sewing something. She said with a smile that she was, and asked what he had already done. The knight was shocked because the little boy dared to call the Duchess sister. The boy said that he had sewn a helmet, and now he was a knight with a potato helmet. He knew that potatoes were very tasty. At that very moment, she looked at him and declared that he would be a formidable and popular knight, and that was why everyone was coming to eat him. The boy was taken aback, as he knew he would not allow anyone to eat him. The lady asked her companion if he could sew by any chance, and he declared that he would be doing it for the first time. She said that in that case, he should collect the pieces of fabric and connect them as best he could, and then she would finish everything else. He wanted to know how exactly to connect them. Smiling, she said that he could simply sew, and no matter how, after a short manipulation, they got a bright and colorful suit. At that very moment, he began to do the work. A moment later, the children approached him and were surprised by the girl's beauty. Wilhelmina said with a smile that this is not just a girl or a guy. This is a cool knight. She said that this is the one who will fight in the clothes they made. At that moment, the children looked at the cool knight with admiration. Wilhelmina was a little puzzled, because when she met the children, they did not say anything like that. But as soon as they met the knight, they immediately complimented him. The children asked with admiration if the knights knew how to ride horses. They wanted to know if a cool knight really saved princesses. He was taken aback as they all pressed him, but at the same moment he declared that he could ride a horse, but had not yet saved princesses. The boys wanted to know if all knights were as handsome as he was, because they had heard before that knights were scary people. Nada was shocked and shouted that they should ask questions one by one. Sometime later, they were going about their business, and the knight looked at his lady with admiration, as he was amazed at the way she took care of the children. She sighed and declared that she wasn't that good. She knew there was nothing surprising about this, and she understood that he had formed too positive an impression of her. At the same moment, she said with a smile that she had done nothing special, and all she had done was give the children some money and make them work. She said with a smile that, by the way, Anna had not earned the money herself, so he did not have to praise her. Nata, in turn, looked at her with even greater admiration and declared that he understood everything. She was taken aback because she realized that the handsome man, even with just a smile, illuminated everything around him. He said with a smile that he now understood what she really was. She asked what she was really like. He smiled and said that she was who she was. But she did not understand what his words meant. They slowly descended from the floor. But at that very moment, they were taken aback, as they heard the knights cry. And at the same time, the knights were shouting that they did not understand the platoon commander at all. The knights shouted and asked the commander why he had volunteered with Sir Nata at all. He looked at them in surprise and asked what everyone was making so much noise about. The young lady glared at them, realizing that they had chosen a bad moment. The knights shouted that the Sir despised them as squires, shouted that as squires they served for many years, but saw how Nata, thanks to his appearance, became a knight after 3 years. The commander sighed and stated that everything they were saying now was nothing more than their complexes. They were furious and shouted that it was not so, because they were offended. They knew that he became a knight without attending joint training. He was furious at this humiliation and quietly said that he had simply been training at dawn. She understood that he trained in secret, so as not to disturb others. The commander sighed heavily and stated that their dissatisfaction with Nat's skill was understandable, but everyone has their own strengths, and his appearance was so outstanding that he was even sent to the Duke's house. He said that the work that required strength would be done by them, and Nata would only accompany the Duchess. He believed that this was simply a reasonable division of duties. She was furious. And so, as he discreetly attributed the female gender to the knights shouted that if they were more beautiful, they could live happily ever after. but the captain declared that they could only accept it. And besides, they were already working well together. The lady saw that he was one of those who always played politics so cleverly to turn the situation to his advantage. At that very moment, the young lady called her knight. She looked at him intently and with icy calm declared that he should raise his head. She saw that when he was in pain, he just put on a cold face. She looked at him darkly and declared that he must definitely win the tournament. He was shocked by her words, as he expected something different. She said that the only way to deal with baseless accusations was to prove her strength. Wilhelmina said that in this tournament, no one knew who their opponent was, and all he needed was to win. He angrily asked if his situation would change if he won the tournament. She knew it was unlikely to change that easily, but she stated that no one could deny his brilliant results. Wilhelmina looked hard at her companion and declared that he must hold his head high and must raise his sword. She said that if anyone judged him by anything other than his skill, he should make them see his blade. She wanted him to prove his skills as a true knight. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for such words of support. After some time, the young lady asked the count if he remembered the order of the ceremony, and he said with a smile that he remembered everything. At that very moment, he recounted to her the order of the ceremony. She was glad that he remembered everything, and at the same time, she declared that he would have to wear a similar outfit with her. The man was surprised because he saw a dress uniform. He wondered with surprise if he would really have to wear it. She said with a smile that it was so, because in this way, the necessary atmosphere was created. And then the lady said that she would wear it too. Wilhelmina said with a smile that everyone knew the count, but she would prefer to hide her face, since she would have to report at the reception. He looked at her in surprise because he didn't understand what she was talking about. The Duchess said that they would be holding a martial arts tournament, and without good commentary, it wouldn't be as interesting for the audience. He was surprised, but still noticed that she was right in her judgments. At the same moment, he thoughtfully asked how she liked Nada. Wilhelmina asked with a smile what exactly interested him. The count stated that she should understand what he was talking about. At that very moment, the young lady's expression changed, and she looked seriously at the count. She sighed heavily as she realized that he really had an unusual aura. His gaze was filled with insight, like that of a commander. Wilhelmina said that she wanted to talk frankly. Since she knew that he was a little weak, she understood that he was in a difficult situation, and the more the count singled him out, the worse the situation became. The count had a slightly different opinion, but she stated that, despite this, he was handling everything extremely ineptly. She said that if he realized that the count was on his side, he could act more decisively. He saw that it was a cold assessment. It was saying that the reason for his defeat was that he naively believed that swordsmanship alone would solve everything. But if he were skillful in winning allies or using his social status, that would solve his problem. The count declared that using internal conflict to one's advantage was unworthy of a knight. Wilhelmina looked at the count with suppressed fury and asked if bullying from others was really a chivalrous act. She asked if it wasn't absurd to demand that the victim follow a code of honor when even the aggressors didn't follow it. He was shocked by her questions. She sighed and stated that there were things in the world that could not be solved by justice alone, and the knight had many resources that he could use. Connections, appearance. She said that if he had acted a little more cleverly, he would not have had to seek outside help. The count asked if she had really told him something like that. She came closer to him and pinned the flower to his uniform, sighed and declared that this was not so. Wilhelmina knew perfectly well that she simply could not say anything cruel to someone like him, because she simply lacked the resolve. The count stated that in the end, she chose the most troublesome path. Wilhelmina said sadly that it just made her angry when people weren't rewarded for their efforts. The count was extremely surprised by her words, but at the same moment he declared that now he at least understood a little what she was like. She asked if it was a local proverb. He looked at her in surprise. As he did not understand the question, she stated that last time Nada said something similar. At that very moment, the count could not resist laughing, while Natasha, standing behind the door with a smile, listened to their conversation. A moment later, he was leisurely walking towards the tournament. He recalled the young lady I had said, that it made her angry when people were not rewarded for their efforts. At that very moment, he realized that he had to hold on to the victory. On his way, he met the captain, who greeted him with a smile. The captain smiled and said that there were too many participants, so it would not be easy to win. He sighed, didn't say it was so, but he could accept the fact that he was hated by the squires who didn't fight alongside him. The captain stated that the knight should not try too hard, because in the end, it was just a tournament, and even if he won, no one would care. Nada knew that the captain and other knights from their order had seen his technique. He knew that they were not only distorting the truth about him, but were also mocking the tournament that the lady had organized. And at that moment, he could not stand it, and asked if this was really an excuse for defeat. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. Nada said that if he was going to fight at a lower level because it was just a tournament, then that sounded like a lie that justified his loss. Nada asked the captain if after the defeat, he would really say that he was simply not serious. The captain did not understand why the knight was so angry, because he simply wanted to cheer him up so that he would not be nervous. Nada said that he really hoped that the captain would not be nervous and would show everything he was capable of. The young man was taken aback, since he had never heard anything like this from the knight before. As he was leaving, he asked the captain if he remembered the rule about removing the mask when defeated. Nada looked menacingly at the captain and declared that even if he had not given his all, it would still be too much of a shame to lose, as it would be a disgrace. A moment later, he sighed heavily and announced that it was time for him to leave. But as he left, he felt the enemy's furious gaze on him. When the lady gave him a small gift, he did not understand why he needed people like him, but now he understood everything. He knew that if he wanted to achieve victory, he had to do it flawlessly in the spirit of the tournament. After some time, the young lady happily greeted everyone present at the tournament. At that very moment, she announced that she was their host and commentator rabbit. Everyone was delighted and did not spare applause for her. She looked at everyone present with a smile and announced that they would start a charity tournament in honor of the winners. Wilhelmina looked at everyone present with a smile and stated that she would like to not make an official statement before the tournament. She smiled and shouted that they should give a loud round of applause to the Count, who had been of great assistance in preparing for this event. The Count was incredibly surprised by this, but at that very moment, he heard the enthusiastic shouts of his subordinates and applause. She knew that in her past life she had been a teacher, and there was nothing difficult about it, so she happily led the event. At that very moment, the Count was filled with wild embarrassment. He came closer to her and bowed low, and the young lady felt wildly awkward, as she understood that he could not salute her because she could be recognized. Wilhelmina stated that everyone already knew that the tournament was a knockout tournament, with the winner of each match advancing to the next round, and they also had to guess who was hiding behind the participants' masks. At that very moment, she pointed out the small prizes that awaited the winner of the tournament, and prizes awaited the spectator who would guess the most participants. She knew that nothing stirs up interest like a good reward. She stated that the winner would receive a special sword created by the blacksmiths of the Grand Duke's house, and the spectator who correctly guesses the most participants will receive snow-white stirrups, which are given only to the greatest racehorses. The sword was given to her by Helena, but the stirrups were left behind when the late Duke's horse was taken away. Since the horse was taken away, she thought that she could leave the stirrups. However, she saw that everyone liked everything and was glad about it. At that very moment, she announced the start of the first masked martial arts tournament, and she invited the slimy slug sulfur and the fragrant pork leg sulfur to the arena. She looked at the young people with a joyful smile and generously asked them to come out to her. After some time, the young lady commented on the fight of the blue bear, who lost his balance and, unfortunately, he accidentally rolled on the ground. Everyone laughed, as they were sure that with such a physique, it would be too naive to hope to hide. The young lady looked at the Count with a smile and asked what his predictions were for this fight. The Count looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such a question. At the same moment, he sheepishly stated that he must admit that the blue bear had excellent physical strength, but his movements were too clumsy. She noted that this was so, because he understood such things. The Count stated that after the fight, additional training awaited him. Everyone present laughed at such comments. At that very moment, the Count handed the microphone to his companion. She looked at everyone present in surprise, as well as at the Count, since she did not expect that everyone would like this idea so much. She knew that if there were several magical sound amplifiers, it would be even better. A moment later, a new duel awaited them. Wilhelmina said with a joyful smile that they had reached the last fight of this round, after which they would be left with 8 finalists who continue to fight in the first quarter of the finals. She said with a smile that now everyone should greet with jubilation the fighters of the final duel, namely the duck from the swamplands. She saw that he was showing his thoughts, although it was not visible because of his clothes. At the same moment she announced the next participant, she knew that this was the most anticipated moment. She announced the Sarah Fairy in a pie costume. Wilhelmina looked at her faithful knight with a satisfied smile. To be honest, she had hoped that he would choose something more comfortable, but she couldn't even imagine that they would sew such an outfit for him. She could see that he had a very heavy suit with no ventilation whatsoever, and yet he had chosen it for only one reason. She knew that the children had worked very hard to make the costume for him, and he was very impressed and happy about it. Wilhelmina understood that if he said something like that, she could no longer dissuade him. But at the same time, she saw that he was too serious. She saw that the costume was ridiculous and uncomfortable, but it was perfect to liven up the atmosphere. She knew that his name had not been mentioned in the knight's guesses, because no one could imagine that he had long since flown out, or that he had agreed to enter the arena with such restrictions. But still, she looked intently at her comrade, wanting him to show everyone what he had learned. At that very moment, he showed off his very interesting and unusual weapon. Everyone present froze for a moment in shock, and his opponent also froze, as he had never seen anything like it. Wilhelmina looked at the knight in bewilderment and wondered if he really intended to fight with the toy weapons the children had given him. At that very moment, his opponent declared that this was too self-confident on his part. He shouted and asked his opponent if he really thought that he could defeat him with childish fakes of a semblance of a weapon. Without further ado, he dealt a terrible and serious blow to his opponent. He was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. At this, the young man in the duck costume froze in a daze, as he saw the threatening aura and strong skill. Nada shouted and declared that in order to make a delicious pie, there was no need to get distracted while the ingredients were in front of him. The young man froze with bewilderment on his face, as he did not understand what his opponent was talking about. Nada shouted that even if he was making a small pie, he had to give it his all. The young lady sighed heavily, as she understood that her knight was incorrigible, and at that moment he looked menacingly at his opponent and declared that the baking was now beginning. All the spectators present began to rejoice and applaud him, but at the same time, they wanted to know who was hiding behind such a costume. She saw that the ordinary soldiers were laughing and rejoicing, but true knights immediately realized that this random blow was not just luck. She knew she needed to pick up the pace, and at the same time, she asked with a joyful smile if the duck knight would be able to resist the cake's provocation. Nada looked closely at his opponent, as he was not going to give up. The lady shouted with a smile that a rare sight awaited them. She said with a smile that this battle was beginning, and they had to watch every step of the young knights. Nada was money, but stereotypes cannot be broken with just ordinary duels, which is why a bright show was needed. She wanted to show everyone a thrilling fight, respect for the defeated opponent, and on top of all this, admiration for the skill of the winner. She knew that in the hearts of the audience, the question was beginning to arise as to who this mysterious fighter was under the mask. She knew they would be waiting for his next fight. And then at some point, you would catch yourself thinking that you were sincerely rooting for the unknown masked fighter. She knew that step by step, everything would get better. In 3 fights, he turned each fight into a real show. His excessive straightforwardness might seem tiresome, but thanks to his impeccable knightly manner of fighting, he controlled the body of the battle perfectly. But there were some opponents who could not admit defeat because they shouted that they had not yet shown all that they were capable of. At the same time, the judges were merciless to the defeated party. Nata only agreed with a satisfied smile and offered to fight again. Then the knightly judges began to rejoice. After some time, he told his opponent with a smile that it was a truly worthy fight. She saw that his self-confidence was a powerful motivator, not only for the common soldiers, but also for the high-ranking knights. But the lady knew that one more detail was needed for the perfect show, a sign that both fighters gave it their all, because even the role of the loser was important. She knew that the moment would soon come, and it seemed that luck was on his side in the draw, since he was only entering the arena now. Moments later, the young lady announced with a smile that the long-awaited final battle had already begun. The final fight was fought by a black horse, who left no chance for his opponents, and Sir Fairy, who won the hearts of the audience. She asked the audience with a smile who they thought would win right now. At that very moment, the young man asked with a smile why they didn't take off their masks, since it was the finale. The lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. He smiled and stated that his identity had already been revealed, and only his rival remained. He did not understand whether there was any point in hiding his identity any longer. At that very moment, he offered to fight fairly and openly. Removing the mask, everyone in the crowd began to whisper among themselves as they were curious about who was revealed under the mask. They understood that taking off the mask before the fight sounded good. She understood that they couldn't act like this because many knights still didn't recognize Nat as an equal. She saw that the scoundrel in the form of a knight took advantage of this in order to keep his escape route open even after losing. Nada, after asking for forgiveness, stated that he could not fulfill the opponent's request, since this suit was hand-sewn by a little lady who lived in the southern lands. Her dream was to try the pie, but life was too harsh, and on her table there was always only stale bread and potatoes. He remembered how she said with a smile that she also wanted to eat a big and delicious pie, and he stated that this suit was created for her dream, and he could not just take it off. At that very moment, everyone in the crowd began to whisper, because they had heard that this costume was sewn by children from the slums. They knew that this was a charity tournament, and everyone had to fight on equal terms. He stated that he dedicated his victory to the fact that delicious pies are the most powerful weapon in the world. The young man was angry because things did not go according to his plan. The lady looked at them intently, as she did not know what would happen next. But at that very moment, she asked the Duke if his knight always spoke so well. The Duke stated with surprise that this was not the case, and that he was usually quite silent. It seemed that his magic was making itself felt. Wilhelmina understood that he could get out of it. She saw that he was not allowing the enemy to get a hold of anything else. At that very moment, her lady declared that while their fighting spirit had not died down, they must begin the final duel. A moment later, their duel began, and the young man actively attacked his opponent, but he dodged. Nata did not spare his opponent and attacked him in response, while at the same time he gave his opponent a lot of comfort. Everyone watched this fight closely, as it was more severe than all the previous ones. The lady saw that her knight had put all his feelings into the fight this time. She knew that in previous duels, he had respected his opponents, but now he was determined not to make a single mistake. At the same time, she saw the rage of the young man, who also had no intention of giving up and attacked the enemy every time. A moment later, the Duke was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. The lady was shocked because she saw that Derek had sped up, and she didn't understand why he did something like that. She knew he was clearly losing up until now. She wondered if he had been hiding his true strength all this time. But at the same time, she knew he didn't look all that talented. At that very moment, the Count, in a calm but alarming manner, declared that the gifter had used magic. She was surprised and asked the Count if he really meant to say that his sword had become faster because of this. The Count sighed and said that it was true, because according to the rules, magic was not used in fights with training balls. But Derek used it so discreetly that it was difficult to catch him doing it. She saw their fight and was very worried about her comrade. At that very moment, she couldn't stand it and shouted that this was a direct violation of the rules. The Count nervously stated that the tournament rules did not explicitly prohibit this, so it was difficult to call it a violation. He said that Nata, in principle, could also use magic. But the problem is that Fairy has too large a reserve of mana, and it will be much more difficult for him to hide it, as Derek did. And if he starts using magic, it will clearly make him look like an unfortunate fighter rather than level his chances. She was shocked because she didn't even know that in this world there were such loopholes in duels. She knew that according to the rules of the tournament, just like in normal martial arts competitions, Defeats were only counted when you step outside the arena or surrender. So she wondered if her friend would be able to win this fight. A moment later, everyone began to actively whisper as they noticed that the young man had started using magic. But they didn't understand why he used magic at the tournament. They realized that Derek was hiding under the horse's mask, and at the same time, they all wondered if he was really that dishonest. Lady saw that people began to notice Derek's magic, but he still continued to use it. Despite this, the fight was in full swing. Wilhelmina understood that it was more important for him to defeat the enemy than to save face in front of the other knights, because he understood that their forces were not equal. Wilhelmina understood that if things continued like this, Nada would lose. She was puzzled and didn't know what to do next. But at that very moment, everyone saw a multi-tiered battle. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback as Nat's weapon broke. She looked at him nervously, still not knowing what he would do next. At that very moment, he threw away his weapon with relief. All those present looked at the young knight with bewilderment, as they did not understand why he suddenly threw away his sword. They assumed that he was surrendering. The lady was very upset by his action. But at that very moment, she began to wonder if he was really going to fight with his bare hands. Wilhelmina could not resist and commented on his actions. And at the same time, she stated that he chose a fist fight, and she hoped that he would come to his senses. All the knights present were very excited, as they did not know whether such a thing was possible, because they understood that he could not win with his bare hands. At that moment, his opponent angrily asked why he had not planned to surrender. Without wasting a moment, he dealt his opponent a terrible blow. His opponent was taken aback for a moment, as he had expected something like this. He was shocked that the young man simply parried the sword attack with his hand. Nata was not going to give up, so he hit his opponent with fury. Everyone present saw the young man fly back with a crash. The audience was shocked by this, because they saw that the fairy was magnificent and did not think that he would actually fight with bare hands. At that very moment, the young man looked at his opponent with fury. At this, everyone present froze for a moment, waiting for the next blow. The young duchess moved for a moment, as she saw that the knight continued to amaze her. She understood that his hand-to-hand combat skills were no, but good. But despite this, watching the duel became much more interesting. She saw how the great knight was only nervous about something like this. At that very moment, Nata saw that his opponent had prepared his blade for a strike. A moment later, the young man dealt his opponent a powerful blow. Nata immediately dodged his opponent's blow. The young man was overjoyed as he realized that his enemy had fallen into his trap. Nata was taken aback and looked at his opponent in surprise, because he had another dagger. But at that very moment, he turned purple, as he realized that the point of the dagger was pointed at him. At that very moment, he realized that the blade was pointed at the young lady. Wilhelmina froze in shock for a moment, as she had not expected anything like this at all, while the young knight was frightened, as the blade was pointed at the lady. She didn't have time to do anything, but the count's friend shielded her with his body, and at the same time, Nata released his strength and dexterously caught the blade. The young knight, frightened, asked the lady if she was okay, but the lady only looked at him in a daze, unable to answer his question. A moment later, she realized that he had real wings. She was amazed because the lady had never seen anything like this before, and she froze for a moment, watching such beauty. The young man, in turn, with a fierce grin, declared that his opponent had gone beyond the arena, and he felt very sorry for the opponent. But at that very moment, with an arrogant smile, he declared that victory was his. Nata was a little puzzled, and at the same time, rage was raging inside him. But at the same time, he couldn't answer anything. Wilhelmina looked at the young man with fury, as she understood that he had deliberately pushed Nat out of the arena. He taunted his opponents because he knew he had already won. Nata sighed heavily, as he realized that he had lost. But at that very moment, the lady approached Derek and asked why he had thrown his sword to her. He was taken aback and asked what she was talking about. Wilhelmina stated that she saw everything with her own eyes, and he really did throw the sword. No, she asked if he really took such a desperate step to eliminate the enemy. Derek looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she really said that he threw him out of the ring on purpose. He didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about. He shouted that a knight would never resort to such dirty tricks. He shouted that it was his opponent who failed to catch the sword and dodged, and at the same time, he called his opponent a girl. Wilhelmina looked at the young man with fury and declared that he should observe the rules of decency and address his opponent by his title. She asked the Count if it was not customary for knights to observe etiquette even during a duel, and the Count stated that it was so. All those present were taken aback, as they saw that the lady had called their commander a margrave. Wilhelmina looked closely at Derek and stated that, judging by his words, he already knew who was hiding under the mask. He said with fury that if he had known about this in advance, he would have definitely won. And at the same time, he asked with fury why he needed to attack her, because she was just a stranger. He shouted and declared that she was simply slandering him without reason. At the same moment, the young lady asked if she was really a stranger, and she took off her mask. She looked at him intently and stated that he knew exactly who she was. The lady asked if he was not trying to eliminate his opponent from the duel. She wanted to know why he threw the sword at her, as she assumed that he wanted to kill her intentionally. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect to see the Duchess under the mask. Everyone else froze in shock, as they were very surprised by her appearance. Wilhelmina looked closely at the margrave and stated that she was disappointed. Because this holiday was made in honor of his knights, she asked how he assessed such a situation. He sighed heavily and stated that it was his mistake, so he wanted to apologize to her. The Count stated that he did not want to bother her anymore, and therefore he would deal with this situation personally. At that very moment, the young man cried out that he really did not know who she really was. He could not believe that the Duchess was standing in front of him. She looked at him menacingly and asked if he really knew that someone was behind him. And trembling with fear, he declared that it was a mistake, and she asked if other knights had been involved in something similar. At that moment, everyone froze. They didn't understand what was happening at all. Wilhelmina turned to the knight and asked him what he thought about this. She wanted to know if he thought it was just a coincidence. At that very moment, he took off his mask and revealed his true form. The young man froze in shock. Nada stated that he believed that those who stood in Lord Derek's knightly order should not harm others. She looked at him in surprise and stated that if he thought so, it meant he was willing to lose to save her. She understood that in this case, she was obliged to help him. The lady said that she was very sorry that everything turned out this way. She should have been more attentive when the knight threw the sword at her. She asked whether this fight should be considered fair, and at the same moment she declared that she could not do anything, and since it was her fault, she took full responsibility. At that very moment, the young lady suggested that they have a rematch, and everyone present was shocked by such a statement. She asked what they would say about this, since it was the use of magic from an unregistered weapon, an attack on a leader they supposedly didn't know, they could write off as an accident, in which case, to avoid similar incidents, they could take off their masks and fight fairly. Wilhelmina looked closely at everyone present and stated that otherwise, the margrave, as a witness, could have carried out a thorough investigation. At that moment, she turned her gaze to the margrave and asked what he thought about this. He stated that it was a very reasonable proposal. The young man was shocked by this, as he understood that he could lose. But at that moment, he felt the intense gaze of everyone present on him. Since the last word was his, he sighed heavily and declared that he gave up. That same evening, there would be a various banquet where the knights would have fun and drink. At the same time, the young lady kept a close eye on everyone, as she wanted order. Moments later, she was distracted as the Mayor Count came closer to her and stated that he was impressed with how well she had handled the situation. Wilhelmina asked if he had finished his speech already. The margrave sighed and stated that this could hardly be called his speech, since disciplinary measures would be better than 1,000 words. Wilhelmina stated that the atmosphere at the award ceremony was tense, which is why she really wanted to see him as a commentator. He said he simply couldn't say he was happy with the outcome, but it was a lesson for everyone, and he was glad that it had at least made things a little easier for Nat. He smiled and said that it was all thanks to her. She sighed and accepted his words. The Count looked closely at his companion and declared that he had heard that before her marriage, she had not participated in politics or social life. But he found it difficult to believe this, since she was a master at managing the crowd. Wilhelmina asked how she could compare to the Count, who had experienced so many hardships. He looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. She stated that she could not have done this alone, and that it all happened with his tacit consent, and she asked if he had not agreed with her every word from the very beginning. The Count smiled and stated that he could not do anything, since he was in the position of commander, and he was forced to learn something new. Wilhelmina noticed that his attitude towards her had become softer than before. Before, he had assessed her carefully, watching her every step. But now she saw that he treated her like a granddaughter. The Count declared that after this holiday, he would return to the border, so he would not be at the Christmas reception. He stated that he would try to adjust his schedule to attend the New Year's banquet, and a moment later, he knelt before her, and the young lady was very surprised. She froze in surprise when she saw that he presented her with the seal of his family. At the same moment, he pronounced his title and declared that he swears that the Right Honorable Duchess rightfully held her title and fully deserved it. The lady was completely shocked, as she did not expect anything like this from him at all. After studying with the Viscountess, they became so close that they began exchanging letters. And lately, she had been telling her every now and then about some boy, and the lady had suggested that the Viscountess was having a hard time. She knew that raising a child was not an easy task. But at that very moment, the young lady remembered the words of the Count, who, with a smile, said as he said goodbye that no matter what anyone said, he would always listen to the words of the Grand Duchess. And he noted that he understood her much better than she thought. She did not know what he wanted to say with such words, but a moment later, all her thoughts disappeared, as she was told that a visitor had come to see her. Wilhelmina was momentarily taken aback and froze in surprise when she saw the visitor. When she saw the knight, she realized that the Count had planned everything in advance. But she also understood that he was just an old, cunning fox. Wilhelmina asked the knight what brought him to her. At that very moment, he bowed his knee before the lady and declared that he had come to her in order to serve under her command. Wilhelmina looked at the knight in bewilderment and wondered if knights could burst in like that. At that very moment, she heard the whispers of her maids, as she realized that this had all turned into a real performance. Nada shouted that if the Grand Duchess did not need a knight like him, he could become her servant, a groom, a cleaner, a floor layer, anyone, because he just wanted to be near her and serve her. She was taken aback and wondered if this was too much on his part. At that very moment, the lady calmly asked him again if the Count knew about this. He said with a smile that of course the gentleman was aware. Wilhelmina was furious, as she realized that the old fox had indeed planned everything. And she asked why he wanted to serve her, since she was sure that there were other women who would gladly accept him. Nada said that she was the only person who accepted him for who he was. She sighed as she realized that she simply had no choice, and this was not part of her plans at all. At that very moment, she presented him with a small letter and declared that he should take it. Wilhelmina presented him with a letter of introduction and stated that she would like him to become her personal knight. She also informed him that she was just about to give the letter to the Count. Everything happened very quickly, and she decided to write it in case he did not find a master. While the great knight looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes, at that very moment he shouted that he swears to serve her faithfully and truly. After some time, the young ladies met with Jane, and Jane stated that it turned out that the spice trading group from the capital was just a front for the main jewelry guild, which was engaged in money laundering. Wilhelmina thought for a moment, as she knew that the ducal family was very strong, so she thought that it would be difficult for the guests to get inside, but no, they were let in surprisingly quickly. Jane said they probably thought the West was easy prey. Wilhelmina said that in this scam, sooner or later, someone would definitely get a knife in the back. Jane said that now that they knew everything, they could keep an eye on the shady characters. At that very moment, June, or the case, turned his attention to his knight and asked, "How about tea?" But she noticed that he was staring intently at something. Wilhelmina didn't understand what had attracted his attention so much that he didn't pay any attention to her at all. But a moment later, she looked away from her hair and saw the workers that Jane had brought with her. She was surprised and asked if there was something wrong with them. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, because I saw a familiar young man. Wilhelmina wondered if this was the same messenger Jane had brought when they first met. She asked her companion if he was one of her people. Jane said that he was her colleague. She hired him to help the knights carry out assignments. Nata noticed that the young man was very skilled. The lady asked if this was true, but at the same moment, she said that perhaps he should be like that, After all, he was a bodyguard. Nada quietly told his mistress that he could not even estimate his strength. She was taken aback because she was very surprised. And at the same time, she wondered if he was really that skilled. She knew that if her knight said something like that, it meant the young man was stronger than most of the swordsmen from the western border. She wondered if Jane would entrust such a man with simple, menial tasks. At that very moment, she looked at her companion and asked if he was really a knight. Jane smiled and said that it was not so, but he was a very reliable man, and she was ready to vouch for him with her name. The lady pointed out that her companion also had her own secrets, and she saw something mysterious in the lady. Wilhelmina couldn't shake the feeling that Anna had seen him somewhere before. A moment later, she was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. She noticed that he was looking at them, but a moment later, their gazes met. For a moment, Jane declared that their conversation could be considered finished, and at the same moment, she declared that it was time for her to leave. She bowed low to the young lady and said with a smile that today she had again learned something new for herself, and therefore she was grateful to her. Nada asked his mistress if Jane had official status as a merchant. The lady stated that this was true, and he asked why, since she had not had time to introduce them earlier. He knew that owning such a store at such an age was very difficult. The lady said that she had problems with limited startup capital. He knew that the trading group also had internal problems. Wilhelmina stated that she had heard that they had gotten rich too quickly and had not had time to build a foundation. Nada said that he had a feeling that there was something more serious behind the facade, so he wanted to conduct a thorough investigation and report to the lady everything he learned. She thought about his words for a moment, but still agreed. She knew they had to keep an eye on Jane. Nada looked at her mistress in surprise and asked why she was sighing so heavily. The lady was taken aback and asked if she had sighed too loudly. He leaned back and stated that it was not that simple. He began to wonder what was bothering him. She said that she had received a letter from a friend, in which there was a rather difficult request. Nada said that if she didn't mind, he could take a look at the letter. She thought for a moment and stated that she did not usually share letters with women, but she considered her a colleague, and so she allowed him to read the letter. The Viscountess wrote about a boy who was the son of a wealthy viscount from the Northwest, who was given to her for the duration of his education at the academy. She wrote that since his party had been chosen for him as a child, the family wanted him to learn proper etiquette in advance, and the child was now living in her residence. Nada read that there was a big problem. The lady sighed and declared that the boy was completely uncontrollable. She said that he was 12 years old, which alone evoked sympathy for the poor teacher. He asked in surprise whether the Duchess should help her. Wilhelmina's expression changed, and she declared that the Viscountess wanted her to meet her student. She knew that in her past life, she had a hard time with children, as they were always up to mischief. Nada asked in surprise why she didn't just send him home. The lady said that most likely his parents regularly donated money to local orphanages, and as a teacher, she could not turn a blind eye to such things, since the Viscountess herself was a volunteer. He sighed as he understood everything and noticed that it was not so simple. Nada asked with a smile if she just needed to meet him, then she could do something similar. He understood that if it was difficult for her to refuse, then she had already decided everything for herself. The young lady looked at her knight in bewilderment, as she did not understand when he had become so perceptive. He smiled and said that if suddenly he could do something for her, he would be glad to help her. Wilhelmina was glad to hear such words, but she also understood that he had helped the children last time and would cope this time. After some time, she finally met with the Viscountess, and when the Viscountess asked for forgiveness for such a request, Wilhelmina said with a smile that she did not need to apologize because it was obvious that she acted out of good intentions. She said that she would be happy to help her, and therefore offered to sit down in order to talk, since she had already made good tea. At that very moment, the Viscountess glanced at the gentleman who was behind her companion. Wilhelmina introduced her knight with a smile. Nada bowed with a smile and greeted the Viscountess. The Viscountess smiled and said that she was very pleased to meet him, and the young ladies saw that even the Viscountess looked more relaxed next to her knight. The madam sighed and stated that their estate was a boarding school where young nobles were taught etiquette. But the longer the boy was with them, the more aggressive he became, and this began to affect the other students. Looking at the lady, she stated that there had been a rather serious incident and that it was no longer safe to keep him in such a place. the lady realized that things were much worse than what was written in the letter. Madame stated that if anything went wrong, she would take full responsibility. She wanted the Duchess to talk to him just once. Wilhelmina understood that when her elders asked for help, it was hard to refuse them. She saw how much Madame cared about the children, and at the same time, she understood that Madame was a real teacher. Wilhelmina saw that when a problem student created problems, she did not give up. The Viscountess knew her limits very well, but she still continued to care for him. Wilhelmina sighed and declared that she would meet him, but she asked Madame not to expect too much, as she had no talent for inspiring speeches. The lady, with a joyful smile, declared that she understood everything, and at the same time, she was grateful to the lady. At that very moment, the young lady asked where the student was now. Madame said that he had come with her because she simply could not leave him alone at home, although she knew that the servants were supposed to look after him, so he should now be in the living room. But a moment later, they were taken aback, as they heard a scream outside the door. At the same time, the elderly man was screaming and smashing everything around him, as he wanted the maid to immediately take him to the Viscountess. The maid was dumbfounded and, overcome with fear, declared that the Viscountess had asked him to wait a little. He was furious, and at that very moment, the young man threw a book at the maid and asked how she dared to contradict him. Wilhelmina did not tolerate this, and immediately declared that he should stop this immediately. But she also looked menacingly at the boy and asked what was going on. The boy stood motionless for a moment, looking at them. But after a moment, he looked at the lady with fury and asked who she was. He did not understand why the servants in the house were so slow. He furiously asked the lady if she had ever told them their duties. The boy said with anger and contempt that it looked like they only had pumpkins for heads. Wilhelmina did not tolerate this, and immediately declared that he was a little punk. The boy was immediately taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like this. Wilhelmina mocked him, as she understood that the Korean warrior spirit was striking back. She looked at him menacingly, and declared that he was simply an ill-mannered puppy. At that moment, she looked at her maid and asked her to take her friend away. She also asked to check if she had suffered from a similar blow. A moment later, she turned her dirty gaze to all the maids who were quietly watching them and declared that they should go to their places. She knew that if rumors spread, they would all find themselves in a difficult situation, and especially the Viscountess, who was teaching the boy. The boy looked at the lady with contempt and indignation and asked who she was. She was furious that he spoke to her informally. She understood that no matter how unbiased he was, addressing the mistress of the estate informally was disrespectful. Moreover, the Viscountess explained to him today's plans, but it seemed that he did not even listen to her. Now it became clear to her how he felt about her instructions. Wilhelmina looked menacingly at the boy and told him to repeat it again. He looked at her with fury, since he saw no one else but her. She had already encountered such students, so she understood that she would have to re-educate him well. The boy was furious because she did not answer him and remained silent. She understood that she could not answer because he did not even need to be explained that he should use the correct forms of address. He knew this very well himself, and it was not due to a lack of upbringing. It was just a problem with his special manner of speech. At that very moment, he called the Viscountess. Wilhelmina, without wasting a minute, looked at her knight and asked him to place the boy in front of her. Nada accepted her order with a satisfied smile. At that very moment, he approached the boy and made sure that he quickly found himself in front of his mistress. The boy was furious and shouted at the knight to immediately take his hands off him. In anger, he began to beat the knight, but he deftly dodged the enemy's small attacks. He looked at the boy with a smile and at that very moment grabbed his hands, but the boy screamed and demanded to be let go. He was furious and did not understand who they were at all. He could not, unfortunately, do anything. And at that very moment, tears appeared on his face. Wilhelmina sighed heavily as she realized that the Viscountess had a very hard time with him. Wilhelmina looked at the boy intently and sternly declared that he should look straight ahead and tell her his words again. She asked how he should treat the colony. He looked at her intently and froze for a moment, because he saw that in front of him was the woman who was the mistress of the estate. She led the knights, and even the Viscountess did not dare to contradict her. She knew that if he had had any intelligence, he would have realized that he had no right to address her in that way. At that very moment, he repeated the same words. She sighed heavily and asked her knight to bring her a chair, as they were going to be late. At that very moment, he could not stand it and called her, calling her "Milady." The boy looked at the lady in bewilderment and asked who she was. Wilhelmina looked menacingly at the boy and asked which nobleman had asked the elder's name without introducing himself. At that moment, he timidly announced that his name was Jace. She was glad that he had already corrected the situation at that very moment. She introduced herself and stated that she was the Duke's widow. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock, as he did not expect anything like this, but he could not utter a word. The lady looked closely at the Viscountess and called her. She looked at the Viscountess with bewilderment, because she did not understand why she suddenly began to communicate politely with her and at the same time observed all the decencies. Wilhelmina, looking at the Viscountess, asked for permission to help her temporarily with the education of the young boy. At that very moment, the Viscountess bowed low to the Duchess and thanked her for her concern. Wilhelmina said that she could not allow an overnight stay, and that every morning they had to take the young gentleman to a separate building. The Viscountess declared that she understood everything, while the boy looked at them in bewilderment. Wilhelmina looked at everyone present with a smile and declared that it was already evening and they could discuss the rest later, since she wanted to have dinner first. The Viscountess apologized, as she realized that she might have caused her inconvenience. But the young lady said that everything was fine, because this was also part of her upbringing. Wilhelmina looked closely at the boy and asked if he had heard of such a teaching method as education at the dinner table. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock. For a moment, he looked at everyone present with anger, as he did not understand why he found himself in such a situation. He looked intently at the Duchess, since she did not even explain why he had been brought to her. But at the same time, looking at the table, he noticed that there was not even meat on the menu. He did not want to eat fish, since he had to throw away the bones, but he did not want to talk about this because he was embarrassed. At the same moment, he declared that he did not like celery. Wilhelmina asked with a smile if this was true, but at the same moment, she declared that they would make baked celery tomorrow. Jace was taken aback by the shock, because he thought that they would replace the dish for him. He was puzzled and understood that if he ate the dish now, then tomorrow, he would again have the unbearable vegetable. He couldn't stand it, and so I grew up and shoved the soup into his mouth. The young lady looked at the boy with a satisfied smile and said that it would be better to ask the servants to cook meatballs tomorrow. At that very moment, his face changed. At the same time, the Viscountess looked at them with a satisfied smile as she saw that progress had already been made. At that very moment, the young lady turned to the boy. At the same time, she asked why he had recently raised his hand against her maid. He casually stated that she had behaved badly. He said that she was a simple servant, but she dared to obey his order, and therefore he punished her. The lady stated that there was a request from the Viscountess first. Jace glared at the lady and stated that he had given his order later. He also casually said that leaving a guest standing in front of the door was a much more serious mistake. Wilhelmina looked at him, holding back her anger, because she understood that his speech was too ill-mannered and imperious, like that of a child. At that very moment, her expression changed, and she asked with a smile if he had been taught the same at home. She realized that he had simply mindlessly adopted the way adults spoke. Jace looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. She said she asked if he had also used his father's services. Jace casually stated that it was true. They were his subordinates after all. She realized that for the child, servants were subordinates who had to unquestioningly carry out the orders of aristocrats regardless of their class. If he didn't like something about it, the servants were to blame. She asked him if he had any brothers or sisters, and he immediately declared that he had a younger brother. She asked what he could say about his brother. Jace sighed and said that his brother was a fool who always cried, that he didn't play with him. She asked what kind of kids he was friends with at the academy. At the same moment, he listed several young men and declared that he was their leader. She looked at him intently and asked about the others. Wilhelmina asked with a smile if he really didn't have any acquaintances from more noble families. He looked at her with shame and declared that he had no acquaintances from more noble families, since they played separately because they were too different. She smiled and said that she understood everything, since the strong played with the weak and the weak with the strong. She said that he was a bully in the yard, who led only subordinates, and he had no one who could bear the title of his friend. The young man was furious because he understood that she was right in her judgment. She knew that bullies were everywhere in the modern world, and that this tendency was exhibited by boys who were physically stronger than others. But here, the role was played by status, distorting the children's ecosystem. She realized that a small performance would be needed for education, and to begin with, she wanted to punish him for breaking the pot. The next day, the young man still came to his new teacher, but he was puzzled because he knew that something was wrong with the lady. He knew she was the Grand Duchess, but she acted like a teacher from the academy. He did not intend to leave things like that, since the boys told him a lot about her. He secretly mocked her because she was so self-important and came from impoverished nobility. He understood that she was on her knees begging the Duke not to be thrown out, since she didn't know how to do anything and she had nowhere to go. He understood that she was an ordinary woman, a hanger-on in the Duke's house. He intended to show her what real education was, and so at that very moment, he opened the door and shouted that he had arrived. But at that very moment, he froze in place in surprise, as he noticed a very unusual picture. The Duchess looked at the boy closely and declared that he had come just in time. He looked at everyone present with bewilderment, as he did not understand what was going on at all. The Duchess looked closely at her maid and declared that she was being suspended from work for a month, during which time she should think carefully about her actions. The young maid looked at the Duchess with tears in her eyes, but she still accepted her reprimand. He realized that she was being punished for yesterday. At the same time, he mocked the maid because he realized that she had received the punishment she deserved. The Duchess looked at the boy closely and declared that he could pass, but she also noted that he had arrived earlier than she had expected. Jace, with his nose in the air, declared that he had even gotten up early today, as the Viscountess was in a great hurry. She looked at him with bewilderment and said that she was very sorry. He did not understand what was wrong with her because he saw that she was not sorry at all. It infuriated him, but he continued speaking anyway. The lady interrupted him and asked if he would like to do her one favor before they started training. She stated that he had to sign one document. He was a little surprised and did not understand what she was talking about. A moment later, he asked what she had given him. Wilhelmina sternly declared that he had new hands. In order for the punishment of a maid, she asked the boy if he really needed to read the contents. He was taken aback and shouted that he could read himself. At that very moment, he began to read and realized that the maid was being punished for her disrespectful attitude towards him. And he, as the injured party, had to sign the document as confirmation of the punishment. The lady looked closely at the boy and said that he must read everything carefully and sign, and he must also put his family name. He asked in surprise, if he didn't sign the document, wouldn't the maid be punished? She looked at him menacingly and declared that everything was correct. At that very moment, he began signing the document with a satisfied smile. He acknowledged that the maid had disobeyed the order and shown disrespect. He hereby confirmed the maid's punishment. A moment later, with a joyful and satisfied smile, he handed the document to the Duchess. She looked at the document with a smile. At this, the boy looked at her with bewilderment, since he did not understand her expression. Wilhelmina stated that everything was fine and everything had been confirmed, and now he had to sign something else. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he really had to sign another sheet of paper. Wilhelmina looked at him soapily and declared that everything was true to her, since she had given him the bill that he had to pay. He was taken aback because he didn't understand what she was talking about. At that very moment, she looked at the boy with a satisfied smile and declared that he had to sign all the documents. Wilhelmina stated that she was providing him with an appraisal report and an invoice for the pot he had broken, since he had broken a pot that had an ancient history and had been passed down from generation to generation. The interest was set at the standard rate of the Imperial Bank, so he had to pay everything. The boy was taken aback because he did not understand why he should pay for the potty. Wilhelmina looked at him menacingly and declared that everything was elementary simple because he had broken it. He was shocked and shouted that it was the maid's fault, and that was why she was punishing her. Wilhelmina stated that everything was correct, and she had already punished the maid, but only for the disrespectful way she had treated him. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock. Then the Duchess declared that he should read the document carefully. At that very moment, he began to read the document, where he confirmed the servant's punishment with his signature. Jay screamed furiously at the young lady that this was pure fraud on her part. He shouted that he had no intention of signing such nonsense, since the maid had broken the pot. The lady stated that her maid had already received her punishment. He was furious and shouted that it didn't mean he was guilty and that it wasn't fair. Wilhelmina looked closely at the boy and asked if the pot had broken itself. She stated that there were plenty of witnesses besides him. He was taken aback, as he could not say anything in response to her. At that very moment, she asked if he really meant to say that he did not agree with the maid's punishment. He shouted that, of course, he did not agree. Wilhelmina stated that he had already signed the document. She said that she had warned him that he was signing on behalf of his family, and that this could not be taken back. She said that if he refused to acknowledge his signature, she would have to take the matter to the imperial court. She stated that he was still a child, so they would call his guardian, the head of the clan. This would be considered as forgery of a document on behalf of the nobility. He was confused and very scared, so he did not know what to answer her. She knew his family had already had problems with the court. Ever since a gold mine was discovered near their property, the Viscount has been constantly dragging himself to court, claiming rights to the mine. She looked closely at the young man and sighed heavily. She stated that now his father would have to go to court again. He was taken aback and stated that he did not have that kind of money. She looked at him with a satisfied smile and said that if he couldn't pay it all at once, there was another option. So the lady asked if he wanted to try. After some time, Nada, surprised, asked the lady's mind whether it was necessary to stage such a performance, since it would have been easier if she had simply punished the boy. She knew that her knight also preferred to resolve all issues with corporal punishment. Some time ago, the boy read a document in which he pledged to conscientiously attend the Duchess's classes for 10 days, and he was shocked. But she stated that he must honestly attend her classes for this entire time, and after that, she would forget about everything. Wilhelmina asked if that wasn't generous of her, and he was truly shocked by her statement, but he couldn't answer. She smiled and asked why he was waiting, since he had to sign the document. Wilhelmina sighed and stated that perhaps someone could be tested with a stick, but she wanted to teach the child that it was impossible to beat someone with a belt. He asked if she really decided to raise him without punishment. He asked if she really thought that he would suddenly repent in 10 days. Wilhelmina did not answer his questions, but nevertheless, she wanted to try to do something like this. She knew that this was the earliest, and perhaps the last chance. He asked in surprise why the latter, while the young maid was saying goodbye to her mistress with a joyful smile as she was leaving on a long-awaited vacation. Wilhelmina asked the knight what he thought was the best time for a person to understand his actions. He looked at her with bewilderment and said that a person becomes aware of his actions when he grows up. She stated that this was not true, because a person began to realize this when the harm he had caused was still minimal. Nada froze in shock for a moment, as he didn't expect to hear something like that. The lady stated that if left untreated, he could go much further and become a truly cruel person. She knew that, fortunately, his antics could still be resolved with a simple apology. But she understood that if he crossed the line and started to break down, it would be impossible to stop him. So then she wanted her faithful knight to use force. He looked at her with a gentle smile and declared that his rudeness towards the elder mistress could not be atoned for with one rod. But if it was her order, he would punish the boy so that there would be no fractures. She was shocked and wondered if they really broke bones with an ordinary rod. After some time, the boy looked at the small notebook with bewilderment and asked the lady in surprise what he should do with it. Wilhelmina, in turn, gave the boy a collection of problems and said that he had to solve 10 pages a day. But there were only 100 of them, and he had to solve the whole house. He asked with bewilderment, "Was that all?" She smiled and said that it was so. He asked with a smile if he decided everything, he would be able to leave early. She said that it was so, but if he delayed, he would stay longer. At the same moment the young man began to make a decision, she sighed, as he did not listen to her. Wilhelmina sighed and declared that he could begin solving the problems. But after a few seconds, the boy was taken aback. He was shocked because there were a whole ton of tasks, and he was screaming that it was some kind of nightmare. Yawning, the young lady stated that there were many tasks there, but she asked him if he really thought that the payback would be easy and quick. This textbook was notorious even in the capital's academy due to its exorbitant number of assignments and insanely varied formats. Teachers adored it, but students hated it, and those who had ever encountered it dreamed of burning it. She looked at him with a smile and said that if he couldn't handle something like that, he could have refused right away. The young man was furious, but at the same time, he could not refuse. After a moment, he finally got down to work. The young lady knew that the next candidate would soon arrive to develop the situation. She heard a knock and allowed the man to enter the room. The young lady entered my room and greeted the elder lady. The boy looked at the girl in surprise, as he did not expect to see anything like this. Wilhelmina looked at the girl with a smile and asked if she had come to study again. Marina smiled and said that was true. The lady said that the table was currently occupied, so she would have to sit in front. Marina smiled and agreed with the lady. Jace, in turn, looked at them with bewilderment, as he did not understand what was going on at all. Some time ago, Nada asked the lady what she was going to use. He wanted to know if her plan would work. The lady said with a smile that she had come up with something, and her plan would work as expected. She approached the girl with a smile and said that they should repeat what they learned yesterday. Jace looked at them sullenly, and he was a little embarrassed. She knew he would fall for a pretty girl. After some time, it was time for lunch, and the young lady asked with a smile if they would like to eat. Marina smiled and stated that she had brought lunch with her. At that very moment, the lady asked the boy if he would go with her to the dining room. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she had really suggested eating together. The lady stated that there was no one else there, so they would have to eat together. He was a little taken aback by such a proposal, and the lady saw that he had such an expression on his face as if he would never eat with her. She smiled and said that if he didn't want it, she could have the dish brought straight to the room, and she asked if he wanted to eat with Marina. He asked in surprise if that was really possible. As she left, the lady stated that this was so, and they could eat together. Marina was delighted, but the young man did not answer. Nada met his caretaker and asked if she was already free. She asked in surprise how long he had waited, and he said with a smile that he had not waited long. A moment later, he handed over to the lady the permission from the head of the family, sent by the Duke. She obtained entry permission for the boy she had asked Mikhail for, and she was surprised that he had prepared everything so quickly. But she also assumed that he had definitely been keeping an eye on the Viscount. Wilhelmina thought that it was most likely connected with the recent discovery of a gold mine in the Viscount's lands. Nada looked closely at the lady and asked if everything would be okay. He didn't know if it was possible to leave the children alone. The lady looked at her knight with a satisfied smile and said that he did not need to worry because she knew that this method would work. She knew that the girl was very sweet, so he would try to please her. Wilhelmina looked at the knight intently, as he did not seem to believe her. Nada asked the lady in surprise why he had treated her so rudely. He said that if she was to be believed, he should have tried to please her too. But a moment later, he sheepishly stated that she should just forget about his words. The lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was so confused. The young lady looked at the boy with a radiant smile and greeted him, and she also did not forget to introduce herself. Jace looked at the young girl in confusion, as he did not understand why she, a servant, addressed him as a friend and not as a young master. Marina came closer to him and asked with surprise if he really had a collection of problems. He looked at her sullenly and said that she should not touch anything, since he had not yet solved the problem. She smiled and said that she would just look, since it looked like a foreign language. Jace sheepishly stated that it was math, but he wondered if she didn't know that either. Marina said with a smile that she also did mathematics. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was simple arithmetic. She asked in surprise if it wasn't the same thing. The young man sighed heavily and stated that these were different, since he had learned to solve similar problems 7 years ago. At that very moment, he described it, as if he realized that it sounded like bragging. He didn't understand whether he needed to say something like that. He started to speak, but she interrupted him and said with admiration that it was amazing, because she still hadn't done everything, and he had already solved similar complex problems. The young man was taken aback and blushed, but he still agreed with her. He stared at her for a while, as he saw that she looked very much like a puppy, while the lady looked at him with admiration as he was really cool in her eyes. Jace, looking at his companion, said that she would also quickly learn to count. She asked when she would be able to write in such a foreign language. He said that it was not a foreign language, but formulas, and she was about 10 years old. She would need to study to find out how it was all solved. At that moment, the young lady's expression changed, and she became sad, as it had been going on for a very long time. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand why she suddenly became sad. She said with sadness in her voice that 10 years was too long, because she only had time to study at lunch and before bed, and Madame would not be able to take care of her all the time. He was surprised and did not understand what was wrong with her studies that made her so sad. Then he declared that when Madame was unable to, he would help her, since he would stay at the estate for 10 days. Jace stated that he didn't want to have lunch alone with the lady, and he would still constantly run into Marina in the office, so he could help her at least somehow. At that very moment, he raised his nose and declared that she should be grateful to him for his kindness, since he was unusual in the academy, what place he occupied in his studies. At that very moment, the young lady grabbed his hand with a joyful smile and thanked him. As she was glad that she had such an intelligent friend, she said that she would definitely thank him. Jace, in turn, was worried and looked at his companion with embarrassment, since there had never been an aristocrat in history who taught a commoner. But at the same time, he was very embarrassed, since she, a girl, touched his hands without asking. Marina looked at him with a smile and offered him to have lunch and study together. She said that she had bread that her friend made, so she offered him half. At the same moment, he casually stated that he had never eaten such food, and that soon the servant should bring him something to eat. She smiled and said that in that case, they would eat separately, and the young man said that he could share his soup with her, and she said with a smile that she loved him very much. In the end, he was only able to solve 8 pages from the textbook. At the same time, he assumed that the Duchess would scold him, but she only said with an understanding smile that he should come the next day and sort everything out. After some time, he arrived at the Viscountess's estate, where Madame greeted the young gentleman and asked if he had studied well. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand why she had such a calm expression on her face. Then he stated that everything went fine, and instead of studying, he only solved problems. A moment later, he announced that he would go upstairs. At that very moment, the Viscountess announced that he had received a letter from the family of the Count, with whom the young gentleman's engagement had been arranged. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock, but at that very moment, he demanded that they give him the letter. A moment later, he began to read the letter carefully. The Viscountess looked closely at the boy, as she was curious about what was written in the letter. A moment later, he handed her the letter and announced that it was time for him to go upstairs. The Viscountess saw that he had received a letter from the Count's wife. The Countess asked the boy if he had studied hard, and she regretted that his grades in history left much to be desired. But at the same time, she assumed that this was only because his family history was limited. She wrote that they expected excellent grades from him, as well as success in the tasks that they would have to shoulder in the future. She hoped that he would learn a lot. And at the same time, she wrote that I was counting on him. The Viscountess understood that this was all very difficult, since she seemed to encourage him, but at the same time she seemed to impose more and more obligations on him. She understood that for a 12-year-old child, this was too much responsibility. At that moment, she sighed heavily and suggested that he could have become like this because of such an attitude. At the same time, the young boy sat quietly in his room, as he was having a hard time because of this. The next day, the young man came to the Duchess's classes again. She greeted him, yawning, and said that the problems were on the table and he could begin solving them. But she also said that if he didn't know something, he could ask her questions. He always looked at her with skill, because he did not understand what kind of Grand Duchess she was, who constantly yawned in front of guests. He understood that this was not a lesson giving new tasks, and not training in aristocratic manners. He did not understand why he signed such a contract at all. At first, he thought it was just a cruel joke to tease him, but she didn't seem to be particularly interested in it. He also knew that she behaved like a real teacher with the young lady. He couldn't say that he craved the Grand Duchess's attention. Rather, he felt humiliated by being ignored. But at the same time, he was furious, and the tasks really irritated him. He did not understand why they were so difficult. And at the same time, he wondered who created such a textbook. He knew that if this were their estate, he would have immediately fired the tutor who gave him such homework. A moment later, the young man consoled her, as he saw that his mentor was simply sleeping in a similar situation. This made him very angry, and so he decided that he would not study. Jace immediately dropped his textbook and headed for the exit. But as soon as he opened the door, he saw a young lady. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really come to study. She said with a smile that it was just work, and there wasn't much, so she had a break and decided to go to see Madame. He was a little embarrassed as he saw that she had a childish manner of speech. Taking the textbook from the young lady, he wondered what was so good about studying. But at that very moment, he was taken aback, because you saw that her textbook was very tattered. Jace asked in bewilderment if she really had a different textbook today. She said with a smile that it was so, because she didn't know something and came to ask Madam about everything. Jace casually asked what she didn't know, but at the same moment, he declared that she should follow him, because he would show her everything. She was puzzled, because she wanted to approach the Madam, but he declared that she was currently sleeping. At that very moment, the young lady herself saw that Madam was sleeping quietly. He looked at her intently and stated that she needed to sit down quickly, as they had to complete all the tasks. A moment later, he began to explain. After some time, the young lady happily thanked her dear mentor for teaching her everything. She smiled and said that if it weren't for him, she would have had to go and look for the solution. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked if there really was a solution book. Marina stated that this was true, and Anna had seen many problem books and answers, so she really wanted to solve them all. He looked at her intently, and at the same moment asked if there were any answers to his notebook there. She smiled and said that there were not just one, but 3 of them. He looked intently at the young Duchess and, looking at his friend, quietly stated that she must bring him answers. She asked in surprise why he needed answers. She wanted to know if there was something he didn't know. Jace immediately yelled at his friend and declared that without further ado, she should do as he said. But a moment later, he was taken aback, as he saw that her face had changed to horror, and she was looking at him. He looked at her menacingly and said that he needed answers, because he had just helped her, so she should do him a favor, because they were friends and should repay each other with kindness. She wrote and stated that you can only enter the room with your own answers. She said that she was told that you can only take what you need and not touch what belongs to others. He looked at her closely and asked where such things were located. She sighed heavily and stated that the solution book was in the office of the former owner. He wondered if she really meant the previous Duke's office. He knew that the Duke had died and that a lady had used them, and she was just a regular parasite in the house. If he just hung around there for a bit, no one would say anything to him. Jace looked at his companion closely and asked if she had been ignoring him. He asked if she thought he was going to steal something from the office. He stated that he only wanted answers. He understood that if he could solve these problems, he would go home and the Viscountess would not tell him anything. At that very moment, the young lady declared that she would ask Madame, but he shouted that she should not do anything like that. Jace walked closer to the lady and stated that they were friends. He asked if she couldn't fulfill one request of his. He said that if she reported the concrete madam, he would no longer be friends with her. He said that he would no longer help her with her studies, and that he would not even say hello. At that very moment, the young man saw her eyes, which were filled with tears. His expression changed, and he managed to force out that he would not leave her alone. He said that she should think about his words, but he asked her to do something like this just once. A moment later, she sighed heavily and agreed with him. As she left the room, the young man told his companion that if they quickly took everything and left, no one would know about anything. As soon as the door slammed, the young lady woke up and looked menacingly after them. The next day, the young lady checked the young man's answers. He knew that all the answers were perfect, since they were made especially for this collection, and all the tasks were written there, thanks to which he was able to pass the test without raising suspicion. He knew he could do something like that because no one was watching. He saw the Duchess chatting in the garden with some ragged boy. Then she was sitting at a table with pages and folding paper airplanes. He assumed that she was not really the eldest madam. Be that as it may, copying the answers in such a fuss was as easy as pie, and he was glad about it, although he did not expect that there would be as many as 3 sheets of answer paper. Some time ago, he told his girlfriend that this is not all, and she should bring the next sheets. She was excited, but he stated that it makes no difference whether he transfers to 1 or 2 sheets. Jace sternly declared that if she did not deliver them to him, he would pester the head madam. He asked if this was okay with her. She sighed heavily and announced that she would bring it to him. He was pleased with himself because, as soon as he mentioned the lady, the girl immediately agreed to everything. He understood that it was convenient, but he knew that soon all his studies would end. A moment later, all his thoughts disappeared as the young lady hurried towards him with a joyful smile. He always skillfully looked at her, as he knew that usually at this time she should be working. She came to him only after she had done all her homework. At the same time, he wondered whether Madame had really assigned the girl to him in place of an ordinary servant. He knew that she followed him around with a joyful smile every time and offered him something to eat or to play some fun games. All the games she wanted to play were childish, but he knew he was bored in a place like that, so he went along with her. After some time, the young lady announced that she had brought him the answers. He praised her with a smile and took them away. He knew that if he played along with her a little, nothing bad would happen. Marina looked at him in surprise and asked if he had read the book. He asked in surprise if she really had a book with the founding myth of the state. And at the same moment, he declared that this book was on the required reading list. She said that she had read it in the evening, but did not understand much of it. He sighed heavily and asked her where she was having trouble, and she immediately showed him. After a moment, the young man began to tell her, to explain everything. But he realized that it was a little tiring. He wondered if he should take her to the main house. He knew that when he became a high school student, his personal servant could go with him. A moment later, she asked how the name of the first emperor was read. He stated that it was not a name at all, but his title, and it was read as a solar chariot. He stated that the first emperor descended from the sun to the earth on a chariot, and it was said that before his arrival, a prophecy was sent to the continent, so they were all waiting for him. She sighed and stated that it must have been very difficult for him. He asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. She said that the empire was big, and there were a lot of people. If they all relied on him, it must have been hard for him. Marina said that when Anna said that the madam in the castle was too cold and difficult to be with, the eldest madam replied that the person everyone relied on was always hard and lonely. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she really said that. Marina stated that this was so, and she remembered her words. And she thought that it would have been hard for her too if everyone had paid attention to her at the beginning of the journey. She said that she would be in the place of the emperor. She would have burst into tears long ago. After all, it is very difficult to live up to the expectations of others. He sighed heavily and declared that this is precisely the duty of an aristocrat. He asked her if she didn't know the saying, "The more power, the greater the responsibility." Marina looked at her comrade in surprise and asked why he was deceiving himself for this. She asked if she was in pain, and it was hard for her. What should she do? She said that a ravine for oneself is not cool at all. Marina stated that she would never do something like that. He asked in surprise what she would have done then. Marina said she would have told Madame that it was hard for her. He looked at her closely and asked her what she would do if the elder madam was in trouble. She thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He knew that everyone's eyes were on him, as he was the eldest son of a genius viscount who entered the academy for the first time at such a young age.